Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Super Harry. In today's episode, we explore, what if Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry and demanded full healer scan that revealed 43 blocks and Dumbledore's master plan. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Hat screams. The Great Hall of Hogwarts had seen 1,000 sorting ceremonies. It had watched nervous children shuffle forward one by one, had listened to the Hat deliberate and announce, had absorbed the applause and the whispers and the relief of 11-year-olds finding their place in the world. The enchanted ceiling had reflected 1,000 September skies. The candles had floated in their familiar constellations. The ghosts had drifted along the edges of the room in their customary positions, half interested, half bored, the way only the truly immortal can manage. Nothing about the evening of September 1st, 1991 suggested it would be any different. The first years filed in behind Professor McGonagall, their robes new and their eyes enormous. They moved in a tight cluster the way frightened animals do, drawing comfort from proximity, and the older students watched them with the particular smug fondness of people who had survived something and wanted credit for it. The ghosts made their customary entrance, nearly headless Nick dropping dramatically through the ceiling to introduce himself to the new Gryffindors, the bloody Baron floating silently past like a cold patch of air, the fat friar beaming with genuine warmth. Harry Potter walked near the middle of the group. He wasn't thinking about the sorting. He was thinking about the ceiling, because he'd never seen anything like it, the deep purple black of a real September sky, the stars already sharp and clear the way they only got far from cities, the whole thing so convincingly open that his chest did something complicated and he had to remind himself he was indoors. He'd spent 10 years in a house where his bedroom had no window. The ceiling of the Great Hall felt like the first honest thing he'd encountered since Hagrid had knocked down a door and handed him a birthday cake. He almost missed his name being called. Potter, Harry. The whispers started immediately. He'd expected that, Ron had warned him on the train, and anyway he'd been hearing his own name in hushed tones since he'd walked into the leaky cauldron with Hagrid back in July. He walked to the stool, sat down, and felt the ancient hat settle over his head, dropping past his ears, smelling of old leather and something else, something older, like stone and static electricity and turned pages. Then the hat went very, very still. Harry waited. He'd watched it talk to 4 students already, sometimes quickly, sometimes after a long pause, but there had always been a sense of process, of consideration happening, of some internal machinery turning over. This felt different. This felt like the machinery had ground to a halt. Hello? He thought, feeling slightly ridiculous. The response was not words. It was something he felt rather than heard, a sharp, sustained note of alarm, the way a fire alarm sounds before your brain processes what it means, and then something that was unmistakably distress, and then the hat shifted against his hair and he thought he heard it make a sound he couldn't categorize, something between a gasp and a recoil. Professor McGonagall, standing 5 feet away with her scroll and her impeccably controlled expression, noticed the pause extending past comfortable. She kept her face neutral with the practiced ease of someone who had managed 39 sorting ceremonies, but her eyes sharpened. The hat didn't speak. The Great Hall began to murmur. 10 seconds became 20. 20 became 40. The first years clustered at the front began exchanging looks, some amused, some anxious, one red-headed boy with large hands craning his neck to see what was happening. Across the hall, the older students shifted and whispered. At the head table, several professors exchanged glances. Dumbledore, seated in the center with his hands folded and his expression serene, did not change his expression at all, which was itself a kind of expression. Then the Sorting Hat spoke. Not to a house. Not to Harry. It raised its patched brim toward the enchanted ceiling, toward the 1,000-year-old stones of Hogwarts, toward whatever audience it had been speaking to for a millennium, and it said in a voice that was not the gentle, considering voice it had used for the other 4 students but something raw and resonant and appalled, I will not. The Great Hall went completely silent. McGonagall took 1 step forward. I beg your pardon. I will not sort this child. The hat's voice had steadied into something cold and deliberate. Not until this hall summons a healer. Not until someone in this room explains to me why this boy is carrying 43 separate magical interferences in a body that has not yet finished growing. Not until someone accounts for what has been done to him. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the kind that came before. The kind before had been surprise. This kind was the silence of a room full of people trying to understand what they just heard and the failing producing something close to fear. Harry sat on the stool with the hat over his ears and his hands in his lap and thought, very clearly, oh. 43, the hat said again, and something about the repetition, the flatness of it, the refusal to soften the number, made several people in the room flinch. Bindings. Suppressions. Memory modifications. Compulsion charms. A loyalty anchor tied to a Muggle family. A will-reading block. And at the center of this child's magical core, something that does not belong in any living person. Something that should not be possible. I will not sort him. I will not put a house name on a child who has been systematically dismantled, as though naming him compensates for what has been taken from him. McGonagall's scroll was no longer in her hand. She had no memory of letting it go. She was looking at the hat with an expression that she would later describe to herself as professional concern, though in the moment it felt considerably more than that, it felt like the floor had gone soft. Albus. She said it quietly, and she didn't look at the head table, but the word carried weight. Dumbledore rose from his chair with the unhurried grace of a man who had managed crises for 60 years. His robes were deep purple, his half-moon spectacles caught the candlelight, and his face held a particular expression, warm, faintly troubled, faintly sorrowful, that he deployed very precisely in moments when he needed a room to trust him. Perhaps, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall with the ease of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard, we might continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate. Mr. Potter, if you would accompany, no. The hat again. Firm as a closing door. This conversation happens here. In front of witnesses. A pause, and something in the hat's voice shifted to something harder. I have been silent for a very long time, headmaster. I have sorted children for 1,000 years and kept my counsel, as I was designed to do. But I was designed to sort. To read. And what I am reading in this child is not something I can process as background information. What I am reading is a crime. At the Gryffindor table, Percy Weasley had gone very pale. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was very still in a way that meant he was paying closer attention than he wanted anyone to notice. Hermione Granger, standing in the cluster of unsorted first years, had her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that made the boy beside her take half a step away. Harry had not moved. He was sitting on the stool, the hat over his head, and he was listening. It was an odd experience, listening to someone describe you as though you were a crime scene, but he found he wasn't frightened. He wasn't sure what he was. There was something happening in his chest that felt like a key turning in a lock that he hadn't known existed. What kind of interferences? He asked. He directed it upward, toward the hat, keeping his voice low and even, but in the silence of the hall it carried. The hat, who had apparently decided that the ceremony was no longer a ceremony, answered him directly. 17 suppressions on your magical core, layered across several years beginning before your 2nd birthday. They've slowed your magic's growth and kept your natural reserves significantly below what they should be. You have been operating at roughly a third of your actual capacity since before you could speak. There are compulsion charms tied to specific behavioral patterns, compliance, self-deprecation, a learned tendency to minimize your own needs. There is a block on your occlumency, which is particularly relevant because your natural shields are. The hat paused, and its next words carried something that sounded like genuine astonishment, extraordinary. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure you couldn't use them. There is a poverty glamour on your financial accounts. A fame aversion charm designed to prevent you from seeking knowledge of your own history. A blood adoption record seal, something about your parentage has been deliberately hidden from you. And there is, another pause, longer this time, weightier, a ritual binding in your scar. Something designed to activate at a specific point in the future. Something that, if I described it plainly, would require this hall to reckon with choices that certain people in this room have already made on your behalf. Harry said nothing for a moment. Then, still calm, still quiet, who put them there? The hat did not answer immediately. The silence stretched. And in that silence, Harry looked out from under the brim of the hat. He tilted his head slightly so he could see past the battered leather, and he looked at the head table. At the long row of professors with their various expressions of shock and anger and carefully maintained blankness. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore met his gaze with those bright blue eyes, and his expression was everything it should have been, concerned, pained, the expression of a man watching something unfortunate unfold that he had done his best to prevent. It was a masterful expression. Harry looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at his hands in his lap, and the key in his chest turned another degree. "I want a healer," he said, loud enough for the whole room this time. "Now. Tonight." The hat made a sound that, if it had a physical body, might have been described as relief. What followed was not orderly. McGonagall moved first. She was always fastest in a crisis. 39 sorting ceremonies had given her reflexes no amount of chaos could outrun, and she crossed to the head table, and there was a brief, low, very intense exchange between her and Dumbledore that the students closest to the front strained to hear and couldn't, and then she was moving toward the door with the brisk authority of a woman who had decided something and wasn't entertaining objections. Flitwick had already conjured a Patronus, a silvery little terrier of a thing, and sent it racing through the wall with a message for the school's medical contacts. Snape had not moved from his seat, but his eyes had tracked to Harry with an expression that was complicated in ways that didn't resolve easily into any single emotion. Dumbledore had returned to his chair. He sat with his hands folded and his expression settled into something serene and patient, and he watched the chaos unfold with the equanimity of a man who had contingencies. Several of them. Contingencies stacked on contingencies, like a very elegant card house built over a very long time. Harry finally took the hat off. He wasn't sure why he did it, some instinct that said the hat had said what it needed to say, and that he didn't need it over his eyes for what came next. He held it in his lap and looked at it for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I should have done this sooner," the hat said, equally quietly. "I have read many children, Mr. Potter. I have sorted them into their houses and sent them on their way and trusted that the system was serving them. In your case, it stopped. Started again. In your case, I failed you the moment I agreed to have a role in a ceremony where you would be present. Because sorting you was never meant to serve you. It was meant to serve the story someone else wrote for you. I am sorry for my part in it." Harry looked at the hat for another moment. Then he set it carefully on the stool, stood up, and turned to face the hall. 412 students stared back at him. Some with shock, some with fascination, some, the older Slytherins especially, with the calculating look of people filing information away. The first years at the front looked scared in a way that suggested they were now questioning every decision that had led them to attend this school. Harry didn't feel like a spectacle. He felt like himself, whatever that was, whoever that turned out to be, and the room full of eyes didn't change that. "Sorry for the disruption," he said conversationally, to no one in particular, and walked calmly to the end of the Gryffindor table and sat down. A second later, Hermione Granger sat down beside him. She hadn't been sorted either. She set her bag down with a decisive thunk and looked at him with those intense brown eyes. "I'm Hermione Granger," she said. "Harry Potter," he said. "I know." She paused. "Are you all right?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, instead of giving the reflexive, "fine," that 10 years at the Dursleys had installed as a default response. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I think I'm going to be." She nodded, as though that was the right answer, and the two of them sat in the middle of the chaos and waited. It took the healer 23 minutes to arrive, which was, by all accounts, remarkably fast, a Gringotts emergency had once taken 4 hours and involved 17 owls. The woman who came through the doors of the Great Hall was healer Miriam Strout, senior practitioner at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, specializing in curse damage and magical core diagnostics. She was a broad-shouldered woman in healer's robes with a face that didn't do much with expression but communicated a great deal through the way she moved, purposeful, unhurried, and deeply unbothered by authority. She walked through the Great Hall without looking at anyone except Harry. McGonagall appeared at her elbow. "The hospital wing, here is fine," Strout said. "I need witnesses." She said it flatly, in the way of someone who had dealt with institutional cover-ups before and learned from them. "I need everyone in this room to understand what I'm doing and why." She reached the end of the Gryffindor table, looked at Harry, looked at Hermione, said, "You staying?" to Hermione, and when Hermione said, "Yes," she nodded and pulled out her diagnostic wand, longer than a standard wand, bone-pale, carved with thin spiraling runes. "I'm going to cast a full healer's diagnostic," she said to Harry. "It'll feel like someone running their hands through your hair. It won't hurt. The results will appear in the air above you, everyone in this room will be able to read them. Are you all right with that?" "Yes," Harry said. "Right then." She raised the diagnostic wand. The spell she cast was nothing like the quick flash of a standard magic detection charm. It built slowly, starting at Harry's feet and moving upward in a soft phosphorescent sweep, the way you might dust a crime scene, thorough, methodical, leaving nothing unexamined. Harry felt it exactly as she described, a sensation like gentle fingers moving through his hair, except across his entire body, going deeper than his skin, reaching into something he didn't have a word for yet but that felt like the center of himself. The air above him began to fill with text. It appeared in glowing diagnostic script, the formal shorthand of healer notation, abbreviations and classifications and severity ratings, lines appearing one after another in columns that expanded outward as the spell progressed. The students nearest to Harry craned forward. The ones at the far tables stood up on benches. Within 30 seconds, the display had grown large enough that the people at the back of the hall could read it if they squinted. The number appeared at the top of the display. Magical interference count, 43. Someone at the Hufflepuff table let out a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Starting with the core," Strout said, not looking up from her wand work. She wasn't reading the display, she was generating it, feeling the information through her diagnostic tool, translating what she found into language. The subject's magical core has been subject to 17 staggered suppression charms, the earliest dating to, she paused, frowned, 18 months of age. The layering is technically sophisticated. These weren't applied all at once. They were applied over several years, each one calibrated to account for the subject's natural growth and suppress it at approximately the same rate. The intent was not to damage the core but to contain it. The effect is that the subject has been functioning at roughly 30 to 35% of his natural magical capacity. The murmuring in the hall was continuous now, an undertow of sound that nobody was fully controlling. 30%, Hermione said, very quietly, and something in her voice made it sound like she was doing a calculation and disliking the result. Next grouping, behavioral modifications. I'm counting 8 compulsion-adjacent charms. They're not hard compulsions, not the kind that override will directly. They're softer. Shaping charms. They reinforce certain behavioral responses over time, compliance with authority, minimization of personal needs, social anxiety in unfamiliar settings, a specific suppression of anger that would normally be a natural response to one's circumstances. Strout glanced up from the display at Harry with an expression that was still professionally neutral but had something working behind it. Someone was very careful not to make these obvious. They were designed to look like personality traits. To look like the subject. Harry sat very still. Memory modifications, I'm counting 5, but the 5th is layered and may contain submodifications. The earliest is from before age 3. I can't tell you what was modified without a full legilimency assessment, which I am not qualified to perform here. What I can tell you is that the 5 modification points correspond to distinct events, and at least 2 of them are recent, within the last 4 years. Recent, McGonagall said. She was standing at the edge of the display, reading it with her arms folded and her face doing something complicated. Recent modifications. Strout moved on. Financial seal, classified as a glamour-adjacent charm, applied to Gringotts' account access. The subject's actual holdings have been hidden behind a poverty presentation for, she paused, approximately 9 years. The account itself appears to be substantially larger than represented. There's a secondary seal on what looks like a trust account, and a tertiary seal on something designated as, she stopped, and the pause this time was longer, a primary inheritance vault. I'm not Gringotts certified. I can identify the seal but I cannot open it. At the Slytherin table, 2 fifth-years were having a whispered conversation with an urgency that suggested it was about something other than the ceremony. Moving to the anomalous findings. Strout lowered her diagnostic wand for a moment, which was the first time she'd done so. She looked at Harry, and for the first time her professional neutrality slipped slightly and showed something underneath, not pity, not exactly, but something in the family of it. I want to be straightforward with you. I'm going to describe 2 findings they're not standard diagnostic categories. They don't have clean labels because they shouldn't exist. Go ahead, Harry said. She raised her wand again. The first is a bloodline seal. This is a specific form of magical record alteration applied to the subject's own biological signature. Someone has modified how Harry Potter reads to any form of bloodline magic. This includes things like family recognition spells, inheritance tracers, and, relevant here, blood adoption records. I cannot tell you what was changed. I can tell you with certainty that his presented magical bloodline signature does not match what I would expect from a purely natural inheritance pattern. There are markers that suggest either a blood adoption that has been concealed, or a lineage that has been actively obscured. The hall was very quiet now. The undertow of murmuring had gone out like a tide. The second finding. Strout straightened. In the scar on the subject's forehead, which I recognize as a cursed wound from a killing curse rebounding, I am detecting a secondary magical construct that is not curse residue. It is structured. It has intentionality. It is, she seemed to be choosing words carefully, anchored. Connected to something outside the subject's body, in the way a binding spell is connected to its point of origin. And I'm detecting, she stopped again, and this time the pause had a specific quality, the quality of someone choosing between telling the truth and softening it, and choosing the truth, within the binding, a ritual framework. The kind used in sacrificial magic. It is incomplete, it requires a specific trigger condition to activate, but when it does activate, the magical toll on the host would be, she looked at Harry, fatal. That's the cleanest word I have for it. The hall did not erupt. That was the remarkable thing. It went, if anything, more quiet, the specific quiet of shock that is too large for immediate noise, the quiet of 400 people simultaneously understanding something and needing a moment before they could respond to it. Neville Longbottom, sitting 3 seats down the Gryffindor table from where Harry had positioned himself, had gone the color of old paper. Ron Weasley, who had ended up sorted into Gryffindor 40 minutes ago and was sitting across the table from Harry, was looking at him with an expression that Ron would later claim was, just kind of thinking about things. Harry looked at the diagnostic display floating above him, the 43 entries in their glowing columns, the careful clinical language describing a decade of systematic dismantling, and he felt something settle in him like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. Not rage. Not despair. Something more solid than either. Something that felt, remarkably, like the beginning of clarity. Can they be removed? He asked Strout. Yes, she said. Not all at once, removing 43 layered interferences simultaneously from a developing magical core would cause more damage than the interferences themselves. They'd need to be removed in sequence, most dangerous first, over a period of weeks or months. It would need to be done by qualified practitioners. She held his gaze. But yes. They can be removed. Then that's what we'll do, Harry said. He said it simply, without drama, the way you'd confirm an appointment, and somehow the absence of drama was more striking than drama would have been. Hermione, beside him, made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something she was trying not to say out loud. It was McGonagall who broke the silence of the head table. She had been standing at the edge of the diagnostic display for the last several minutes with an expression that had traveled through stages: professional neutrality, sharpening concern, a particular kind of slow-burning anger that only people with very good self-control ever achieve, because most people have to release it before it reaches that temperature. She turned to face the head table. "Albus," she said. "I would like an explanation." Dumbledore had not moved. He was sitting with his hands folded and his expression exactly as it had been, serene, faintly troubled, patient. He looked, if anything, like a man watching a fire that he had foreseen and prepared for and was sorry to see but not surprised by. "Of course, Minerva," he said. "Perhaps we might discuss this privately, I heard," said the Sorting Hat, from its stool, where it had been sitting quietly, the word privately used a great many times over the past century. "I have watched conversations move to private spaces and conclusions arrive that were then presented to the rest of us as settled facts. I believe the Hall has earned a public answer." "The Hat," said Professor Flitwick, to no one in particular, in the tone of someone updating their mental model of a situation, "is still talking." "I have been silent for a long time," the Hat said. "I find I prefer this." Dumbledore looked at the Hat for a moment, and his expression adjusted almost imperceptibly, a microscopic recalibration, the kind only someone watching very closely would catch. Harry caught it because he was watching very closely, and the thing he noticed was that whatever adjusted in Dumbledore's expression in that moment was not emotion. It was strategy. "The interferences described," Dumbledore said, addressing not just McGonagall but the room, his voice carrying its usual warmth and gravity, were not applied carelessly, or maliciously, but out of a profound concern for Harry's safety. "There are forces at work in this world, forces that Harry will need to confront, and the preparations I put in place were designed to give him the best possible chance when that moment comes," Harry said. He said it from across the room, from the Gryffindor table, and his voice was calm. Not angry. Not accusing. Just precise. Dumbledore paused. "The ritual in my scar," Harry said. "The fatal one. You know about it." It wasn't a question. "Harry, you put the will-reading block there," Harry said. The Hat said there was a will-reading block. "My parents' wills. Something in their wills that I wasn't supposed to know." He tilted his head slightly. "You said the interferences were for my protection. But blocking me from reading my own parents' wills, that's not protection. That's information management." The hall was so quiet that the floating candles were audible, tiny shifts of flame in the draught from the windows. Dumbledore looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles, and his expression was everything a grandfather's expression should be, kind, and tired, and carrying the weight of difficult truths. It was the expression of a man who loved the child he'd harmed and found that to be sufficient justification. "There are things," he said gently, "that are very difficult to explain to an 11-year-old boy." "Try," said Harry. He folded his hands on the table, mirroring Dumbledore's own posture without apparent awareness of it. "I'll ask questions if I get confused." Several people at the Hufflepuff table exchanged glances. Dumbledore did not answer immediately. He looked at Harry with those bright, ancient eyes, and for just a moment, a fraction of a moment, barely a flicker, something moved behind them that wasn't grief or wisdom or patience. Something older. Something that had been running a very long game and had just encountered an unexpected variable. "I think," Dumbledore said, "that this conversation should involve healers, the appropriate ministry officials, and, Gringotts," said a new voice. Everyone turned. Standing at the great double doors of the hall, which should have been sealed for the ceremony and very much were not, which meant someone had opened them from outside, was a goblin. He was short and impeccably dressed in the formal robes of a senior Gringotts account manager, and he was holding a leather folder with the kind of careful grip that suggested it contained something significant. Behind him stood two more goblins, and behind them, with the demeanor of someone who had been traveling very fast and was quietly furious about it, stood a woman in ministry robes with an unspeakable insignia on her collar. The goblin looked at Harry with the flat, penetrating gaze that goblins used on people they considered important in a financial sense. "Mr. Potter," he said. "My name is Ragnarok. I am the senior account manager for the Potter family estates at Gringotts Bank. We received a flag on your account approximately 40 minutes ago when a diagnostics report of sufficient severity was filed through the standard healer's protocol." He held up the leather folder. "I have here the full audit of your family accounts, including the primary vault, the trust vault, the 3 secondary legacy vaults, and the inheritance documentation. We also," he added, "have the original, unmodified copies of your parents' wills." He looked past Harry to the head table. "At Dumbledore. We have been trying," Ragnarok said, "to schedule a reading of those wills for 9 years. The candles floated. The enchanted ceiling showed a sky full of stars. Somewhere above the hall, the September wind moved through the towers." Harry looked at the goblin, at the folder, at the unsorted cluster of first-years who were still standing at the front of the hall because nobody had remembered to dismiss them, at Hermione beside him and Neville 3 seats down and the Sorting Hat on its stool. He looked at Dumbledore, serene and patient at the head of his table, with his contingencies stacked like a card house. "Right," Harry said. He stood up from the Gryffindor table and walked toward Ragnarok, and his footsteps were steady on the flagstones. "Shall we?" Ragnarok almost smiled. "We shall, Mr. Potter." "I'd like my friends to come," Harry said. "Hermione." He glanced back. "Neville, if you want." Neville Longbottom, who was still the color of old paper, who had spent his first 11 years being told he was barely magical enough to deserve his family name, who had just watched a hat refuse to sort Harry Potter and a healer describe 43 crimes in clinical language, stood up from his bench with the uncertain urgency of someone jumping off a diving board for the first time. "Yes," he said. "I want." Healer Strout was already gathering her equipment. McGonagall was moving toward the door with the expression she wore when she had decided something irrevocable. Snape, at the head table, had not moved, but his eyes followed Harry across the hall with an intensity that suggested he was doing rapid, private calculations. Dumbledore raised one hand. "Perhaps, you're welcome to join us," Harry said over his shoulder. He didn't stop walking. "But we're not waiting." He reached the doors. The goblin stepped aside to let him through first, which was, Harry would later learn, a significant gesture in goblin protocol. It meant they considered him the primary party. The stone corridor beyond was cool and dim, lit by torches in iron brackets. Behind him, Harry heard the hall beginning to find its voice again, the sound of 400 people starting to process what they'd witnessed, starting to talk, starting to ask questions that would not find easy answers before morning. He heard McGonagall say something sharp to someone who wasn't moving fast enough. He heard the Sorting Hat say, in a voice that carried clearly through the open doors, "The remaining first-years may sit down. We will complete the sorting tomorrow, when this school has had time to reckon with what it has just learned." Harry walked down the corridor without looking back. Hermione fell into step beside him on his left. Neville on his right, slightly breathless, slightly terrified, and entirely committed. 43, Hermione said quietly, as they walked. 43, Harry agreed. That's not an accident," she said. That's a plan." "Yes," Harry said. "A very long one." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you angry?" Harry considered the question with the same honesty he'd applied to her earlier one. The key in his chest. The stone dropping through clear water. The moment in the hall when he'd looked at Dumbledore's expression and understood, not everything, but the shape of the thing. "I'm going to be," he said. "I think there's a lot I don't know yet, and when I know it all I'm going to be very angry." He paused. Right now I'm mostly awake. Like I've been half asleep for a long time and something just turned on a light. Hermione looked at him for a moment, and something in her face shifted, something that would take her several years to identify accurately, but that was, in essence, the recognition of a person you're going to know for a very long time. Good, she said simply. The torches flickered. The corridor stretched ahead of them, stone and shadow and the smell of old magic, deep in the walls, old as the school itself, old as the hat and its 1,000 years of watching. Ragnarok walked ahead with his leather folder, and his footsteps were precise and unhurried, and the wills of James and Lily Potter had been waiting 9 years for this particular walk down this particular corridor, and they were not going to have to wait much longer. Behind them, in the great hall, the Sorting Hat sat on its stool and said nothing more. It had said enough. Chapter 2, The Weight of 43. The room Ragnarok chose was McGonagall's office. He didn't ask permission. He simply turned down the corridor that led to it, tried the handle, found it locked, and looked at McGonagall with an expression that communicated his position on locked doors very efficiently. McGonagall, who had been through enough in the last 40 minutes that a goblin commandeering her office barely registered on the scale of remarkable events, unlocked it with a tap of her wand and pushed it open without comment. It was a good room for what was about to happen. Not too large, not too formal, a working professor's space, stacked with papers and books and the particular organized chaos of someone who was busy and competent and didn't care whether their office looked impressive. 2 tartan-cushioned chairs sat in front of a large desk. A fireplace occupied one wall. A clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the slightly aggressive punctuality of someone who took time personally. Ragnarok set his leather folder on the desk and began removing documents with the methodical care of someone who had done this many times and understood that the documents were the entire point. His 2 colleagues stationed themselves near the door. Healer Strout moved to a corner and began writing notes on a long scroll, occasionally glancing at Harry with the professional attentiveness of someone who wasn't done with him yet. Harry sat in one of the tartan chairs. Hermione took the other. Neville found a spot on the window seat, perching on it with his knees together and his hands folded, doing an admirable impression of someone who was calm. McGonagall stood behind the desk, because it was her desk and she clearly needed the psychological anchor of it. Dumbledore was the last through the door. He closed it behind him, which meant he was the one who decided it was closed, and he moved to stand near the fireplace with the easy authority of a man who owned any room he stood in. He said nothing. He looked at the documents Ragnarok was arranging and his expression was patient and sorrowful and entirely controlled. Harry watched him do it. "We'll begin with the wills," Ragnarok said. He didn't frame it as a suggestion. He held up 2 sealed documents, old vellum, bound with a red cord, the Gringotts seal intact and unbroken on both. "These are the original copies, held in our secure archive since October of 1981. They have not been opened. They have not been modified. 3 previous requests to schedule a formal reading were," he paused for a precise beat, "redirected." "Redirected how?" McGonagall asked. "Paperwork delays at the ministry. Scheduling conflicts." On the 3rd occasion, a letter from the Hogwarts headmaster's office indicating that the reading would be better deferred until Mr. Potter reached an appropriate age of understanding. Ragnarok looked at Dumbledore. That letter was sent in 1983. Mr. Potter was 3 years old at the time. He is now 11. We considered this a sufficient interval. McGonagall made a sound. It was the kind of sound that lived in the territory between a word and a verdict, and it was directed at the fireplace, where Dumbledore stood. "The seals," Ragnarok continued, "are both intact because Gringotts protocol requires a blood-keyed opening in the presence of the primary heir. Mr. Potter." He held out the first document. Harry took it. The vellum was thicker than he'd expected, and cold, and there was something about holding it, something that pressed on the center of his chest in a way that had nothing to do with magic. These were his parents' wills. They had written them down, had put words on paper and sealed them and trusted that the words would reach him. The thought had a specific weight. He pressed his thumb to the seal. It opened. Not dramatically, no flash of light, no theatrical release of magic. Just the quiet snap of a wax seal separating, and the cord falling away, and the document unfolding in his hands. His father's handwriting was larger than he'd expected. Slightly unruly, leaning forward like it was in a hurry. Ragnarok picked up the second will, Lily Potter's, and held it in front of Harry, who pressed his thumb to that seal too, and it opened in the same quiet way, and the two documents lay in his lap and the room was very still. "I can read them aloud," Ragnarok offered, "or you may read them yourself." "I'll read them myself," Harry said. "But I'd like," he paused, then made a decision, "I'd like Hermione to read them too." "And McGonagall?" He looked at Dumbledore. "You already know what they say." Dumbledore said nothing. "That," said Harry, "is its own kind of answer." He read James's will first, and the first thing he noticed was that it had clearly been written by a man who didn't expect to die soon. The tone was practical but light, a man tidying his affairs as a formality rather than a necessity. The provisions were straightforward in the early sections. The Potter vaults, the family properties, the various holdings, all to Lily, and then in trust to Harry, to be released in 3 portions, a living allowance at age 11, full access to the trust vault at 17, and full access to the primary vault and all family properties at his majority. Then the guardianship clause. In the event that both Lily and I are unable to serve as Harry's guardians, we designate the following, in order of preference: first, Sirius Orion Black, Harry's godfather, to serve as primary guardian. Second, Alice and Frank Longbottom, to serve as joint guardians. Under no circumstances is Harry to be placed in the care of Lily's sister, Petunia Dursley, or her husband. This is not a request. This has been written into the family magical compact and is binding on any executor of this estate. Under no circumstances is our son to be raised without knowledge of his heritage, his family history, his financial standing, or his identity as a wizard. Any guardian who withholds this information from him is in breach of this document and subject to the full legal recourse available under wizarding inheritance law. Harry read that paragraph twice. Then once more. His mother's will said the same things in different words. Lily Potter's handwriting was small and precise and moved in straight lines across the page, and her version of the guardianship clause was, if anything, more specific. She'd listed not just who Harry should go to but why, and she'd added a paragraph that read, "Sirius is Harry's godfather and his magical protector." The Fidelius charm was Sirius's idea. "His love for our son is one of the truest things I have witnessed. If something has happened to both James and me, Sirius will need Harry as much as Harry needs him, and the law should not prevent that. I also want it on record that I have significant reservations about Albus Dumbledore's interest in my son's future. Albus has been a mentor, a protector, and a genuinely good man in many ways. He has also, on several occasions, indicated that Harry's future role in the war against Voldemort supersedes his right to a normal childhood. I do not agree. My son is not a weapon. He is a child. Any magical arrangement that treats him as the former rather than the latter is something I oppose with my full legal authority and with everything I am." Harry looked up from the page. Hermione had been reading over his shoulder. She'd leaned close without asking, which under other circumstances might have been annoying, but which he'd found himself not minding, and her face was very still in the particular way it went still when she was containing a strong feeling. McGonagall had read the guardianship clause, and she had put one hand flat on the desk surface, and she was pressing it there like she needed to feel the wood. "Sirius Black," she said. Harry was supposed to go to Sirius Black. "Yes," Ragnarok said. "And the second preference, the Longbottoms." Neville looked up sharply from the window seat. "They were incapacitated," McGonagall said. "Bellatrix Lestrange." They were incapacitated in November of 1981, Ragnarok said. "Mr. Potter was placed with the Dursley family in November of 1981. The timing is, again, that precise pause, notable." "Sirius Black was in Azkaban," McGonagall said. "Sirius Black was in Azkaban without trial," Ragnarok said. "Which is a different thing." He was never convicted of the crime for which he was imprisoned. His account with Gringotts, he remains in good standing, his family vaults intact, has never been officially declared forfeited to the ministry, because no conviction was ever entered. Legally, he remained Harry's godfather and primary guardian throughout. McGonagall turned to face the fireplace. She looked at Dumbledore with the expression of someone who has been handed information they need a moment to metabolize before they can respond to it properly. "Did you know," she said, "that Sirius never had a trial?" "The circumstances at the time," Dumbledore began, "were such that, did you know," McGonagall said again, very quietly, "that the wills named him. That placing Harry with the Dursleys was a direct violation of James and Lily's expressed wishes. The blood protection," Dumbledore said. "Was your priority," Harry said. "Not theirs." He said it without anger. Without heat. "The way you state a fact you've confirmed." Dumbledore looked at him, and the old pain in his eyes was real. Harry could see that it was real, which was the complicated thing about this man. The grief was genuine. The belief in his own rightness was genuine. The certainty that Harry's discomfort now was a reasonable price for some future salvation that only he could fully see, that was also genuine, and it was the most dangerous thing about him. The blood protection, Dumbledore said, would not have functioned in any other location. Lily's sacrifice created a ward tied to her blood, tied to Petunia. That protection was the single most powerful shield I could give you, Harry, against Voldemort's return. A shield that required me to live in a cupboard, Harry said. The room was quiet. A shield, Harry continued, that required me not to know who I was, what I had, who my parents were, what they wanted for me. A shield that required 43 separate magical interferences to maintain. A shield, he said, and now there was the first edge of something underneath the calm, thin as a wire but present, that required me to spend 10 years with people who were legally and magically prohibited from having me, so that when you were ready for me, when it was the right moment for your plan, I'd be exactly the person you needed me to be. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. You are describing it uncharitably. I'm describing it accurately, Harry said. You can tell me the charity later. Right now I want the accuracy. Ragnarok had been watching this exchange with the expression goblins wore when they were in the presence of a financial dispute they had anticipated and prepared for. He cleared his throat. There is additional documentation, he said. He placed another set of papers on the desk, these ones crisp and official, bearing the Gringotts crest. A full accounting of the Potter estates. I'll summarize rather than read the complete inventory. He summarized. The summary took 11 minutes, and by the end of it Hermione had stopped pretending to take mental notes and was simply staring at the documents with her mouth slightly open, and Neville had come off the window seat and was standing near Harry's chair without apparently deciding to do so. The Potter family was, in the language of wizarding finance, extremely old money. Not the largest fortune in Britain, that was the Malfoys, and before them the Blacks, and before them a rotation of families whose names had faded, but old in the particular way that meant diversified, stable, and largely invisible. The primary vault contained gold that had been accumulating since the 1400s. The trust vault, the one Harry had theoretical access to, contained enough for a comfortable lifetime of extravagance. There were 3 properties, a manor in Godric's Hollow that had survived the attack, the cottage was a separate property, smaller, a vacation home really, a townhouse in London, and a summer estate in Scotland. There were shares in several wizarding businesses. There was, notably, a significant collection of books and magical artifacts, sealed in a library sub-vault, including several texts that the Ministry had classified as restricted. None of this had been accessible to Harry because of the financial seal identified in the diagnostic. The seal, Ragnarok explained in the flat, precise language of someone filing a formal complaint, had been placed on the account 9 years ago. It was tied to a specific authorizing signature. Whose? McGonagall asked, because Harry had gone very still and she thought it was better to ask it for him. Ragnarok looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore said, the financial seal was, placed by you, Ragnarok said. Yes. We know. We have the signature on file. Was applied to protect the accounts from Voldemort supporters. There were Death Eaters who had access to the financial tracking systems at the Ministry, and if Harry's full wealth had been visible, the seal was also applied, Ragnarok said, to the legal access functions. Which meant that Harry Potter could not legally initiate contact with his own account managers, could not request documentation from his own estate, and could not trigger the standard minor heir alert system that would have automatically notified Gringotts of any irregularities in his living conditions. He looked at Dumbledore with no expression that could be classified, and all the expression that could be felt. That last function is specifically designed to ensure the welfare of magical children in guardianship situations. It is a standard protection. Disabling it was not. I see, McGonagall said. She said it softly. She said it in the voice of someone reaching the end of a long accounting and finding the final sum to be something they cannot dispute. There is one more matter, Ragnarok said. He reached into the leather folder and withdrew a document that was different from the others, heavier paper, sealed with 3 different wax impressions, one of which Harry recognized from Hermione's description of Gringotts as a bloodline verification seal. The bloodline anomaly identified in tonight's diagnostic. He set the document in front of Harry. We ran a bloodline trace, he said. Standard protocol when an anomaly is flagged. Mr. Potter, your magical signature carries markers from 2 recognized bloodlines. The Potter bloodline, as expected. And a second bloodline, Ragnarok hesitated, and a goblin hesitating was a notable enough event that the room leaned in slightly, that we were not initially able to identify, because of the seal placed on your signature. When we stripped the seal from our records, the second lineage became visible. What lineage? Harry asked. The Evans line, Ragnarok said. On the surface, your mother's family. But the Evans magical markers in your signature are significantly more complex than Lily Potter's own file indicates they should be. Her file, in the Ministry's records, designates her as a Muggle-born witch. The bloodline trace we ran on you suggests, with a confidence rating of over 90%, that the Evans line carries something older. Something that was sealed from the public record. He opened the document. Lily Evans Potter was not Muggle-born. She was half-blood at minimum, and the magical heritage on her mother's side, your maternal grandmother, was sealed from the public record approximately 4 years before Lily began attending Hogwarts. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Why? Hermione asked, because the question was sitting in the room and someone needed to pick it up. We don't know, Ragnarok said. We know the seal exists. We know its approximate date. We know that it was filed through the Department of Mysteries. He glanced at the woman in unspeakables robes who had come in with him and had been standing near the door in complete silence since they arrived. Which is why we brought a representative. The unspeakable, who had remained so still and quiet that 2 people in the room had slightly forgotten she was there, stepped forward. She was middle-aged, with a sharp face and eyes that moved like a hawk's. She pulled back her collar to show her insignia more clearly. My name is Croaker, she said. Senior Unspeakable, Department of Mysteries. I received Gringotts' notification simultaneously with the healer's diagnostic report, because the specific combination of flags triggered a classified file review. She looked at Harry. The file is designated Class 7, which means I can confirm its existence and tell you who filed it, but I cannot open it outside of a formal Ministry inquiry. She paused. I can tell you that it was filed in 1979. That it pertains to a magical lineage of significant historical relevance. And that the filing was authorized by Albus Dumbledore, then Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. The fire in the fireplace crackled. Harry turned in his chair and looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him, and now there was something different in his expression. The serenity was still there, but it had shifted under its own weight, the way a very old building settles, and what was underneath was visible in the gaps. Not guilt exactly, because guilt required a belief that you'd done wrong, and Dumbledore did not believe that. But something. A weight he'd been carrying for a long time, and the particular feeling of having it seen by someone you didn't expect to see it. My mother wasn't Muggle-born, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. That's what you were hiding. Part of what you were hiding. Harry, no, Harry said. It came out clean and flat, not rude, just definitive. Don't explain it yet. I'm not ready to hear the explanation yet, because every explanation you've given tonight has been true and incomplete, and I think the incomplete part is the dangerous part, and I'd like to understand more before I listen to you frame it. Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression. Something that was, if Harry had to name it, the faintest possible trace of something like respect, moving under all the grief and all the certainty like a fish under ice. Very well, Dumbledore said quietly. What I want right now, Harry said, turning back to Ragnarok, is to know about the ritual in my scar. The Death Walk. You identified it, Gringotts can confirm it, Ragnarok said. We cannot give you its mechanics. Curse magic of that complexity is outside our direct expertise. However, he reached once more into the folder, which was apparently bottomless in the way of Mary Poppins' bag. We have a document that pertains to it. Filed in our records as part of the Potter family legacy archive. Deposited by one of the Hogwarts founders. He set it on the desk, and it was very old, the paper was almost leather, the ink faded to a deep brown, the script archaic and cramped. Helga Hufflepuff, as it turns out, anticipated this specific type of binding. She encountered it in her own research into sacrificial magic. The document contains a counter-ritual. It was deposited in the Potter family archive in the year 993, because the Potter family name, he looked at Harry with something that might, on a goblin's face, have passed for significance, existed in 993. Your family is very old, Mr. Potter. Harry looked at the ancient document and thought, okay. He thought it in the specific way you think okay, when the world has expanded to a size that you need a minute to walk around before you can assess it. I want copies of everything, he said. The wills. The financial audit. The bloodline trace. That document. He gestured at the Hufflepuff parchment. Everything. Already prepared, Ragnarok said, and produced another folder, this one clearly meant for Harry, organized and tabbed. He handed it over. Harry took it. Stood up. Held the folder against his chest for a moment. One more thing, he said to Ragnarok. The poverty glamour on my accounts, the financial seal. Can you remove it? Tonight, Ragnarok said. If you authorize it. I authorize it. Done. Ragnarok made a note in his own file. You will find your trust vault at full access as of midnight. We will arrange for a card, a Gringotts access token, to be delivered to you by morning. Thank you. Harry looked at his two goblin associates. All of you. Thank you. The goblins inclined their heads. It was a gesture Harry understood, without having been taught it, was not one they made often or lightly. Healer Strout looked up from her notes. Mr. Potter. The removal of the blocks, the 43 interferences. I want to begin as soon as possible. The ritual binding in your scar is the most urgent, but it's also the most complex. The behavioral compulsions should come first, because they're affecting your cognition right now, today. I'd suggest beginning tomorrow morning. Yes, Harry said. Let's do that. I'll need to bring 2 colleagues from St. Mungo's. This will take several sessions. That's fine. And I'd like ongoing documentation. She glanced at Hermione. If you're acting as Mr. Potter's, I am, Hermione said, before she'd been given a title or a role. She said it with the simple certainty of someone who had decided and was done deliberating. Strout nodded. Good. I'll explain each procedure before we begin it. Harry turned to face Dumbledore, who had not moved from his position near the fireplace throughout all of this. Who had watched the whole audit and the whole reckoning with the composure of someone accustomed to the long view, someone who had learned not to panic at individual moments because he was always watching for the larger shape of things. I have 2 questions, Harry said. Tonight. Just 2. You can answer them or not. But I'm asking them now. Dumbledore waited. The ritual in my scar, Harry said. The Death Walk. Did you know it was there when you left me at the Dursleys? A silence. Dumbledore looked at him with those blue eyes, and his answer, when it came, was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, which meant it was also the worst. Yes, Dumbledore said. I knew. Hermione inhaled sharply. Neville made no sound but his hands tightened on each other. McGonagall said nothing, but she stepped back one step, away from the desk, away from the fireplace, as if she needed physical distance. Second question, Harry said, and his voice was still level, but it was level the way a very deep river is level on the surface, with enormous things moving underneath. The Death Walk. It activates when Voldemort is at full strength. He has to kill me, willingly, knowingly, walking toward my death, for it to work. That was your plan. That was the entire plan. Train me, protect me just enough, make sure I'm brave enough and loyal enough and, he stopped for just a moment, damaged enough that when the moment came, I'd choose to do it. Walk into it. Because you'd need me to choose it. Because I had to go willingly. The fire crackled. Was my mother's sacrifice the model? Harry asked. Is that what you were recreating? Was I always meant to be the sacrifice? The clock ticked. The room breathed. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, 11 years old, slightly malnourished, wearing robes that were almost the right size, holding a folder of documents against his chest that represented everything that had been taken from him and everything that had just been returned, and his expression broke. Not catastrophically. Not dramatically. Just a small, irreparable fracture, like a hairline crack in very old porcelain. You were always, Dumbledore said, very quietly, so much more perceptive than I anticipated. That's not a no, Harry said. Dumbledore said nothing. Harry nodded once. He turned to McGonagall. I'd like a room. Separate from the dormitories, if possible. I want to be able to have people in without it being public. McGonagall looked at him for a moment with an expression that had moved through so much in the past hour that it had arrived somewhere new, somewhere that was not the face of a professor managing a student, but the face of a person who had just understood the shape of a wrong and was deciding what to do about it. The third-floor guest room, she said. It's not used. Thank you. I'll take you there. She moved to the door and stopped, her hand on the frame. She looked back at Dumbledore once. The look lasted less than a second. Then she left. Harry followed her. Hermione followed Harry. Neville followed Hermione. At the door, Harry paused. Not to look back. Just paused, hand on the doorframe, feeling the old stone under his fingers. Behind him, Ragnarok was packing his documents. Croaker was making notes of her own. Healer Strout was completing her file. And Dumbledore was standing by the fireplace, alone now in a room that had just been rearranged around him, his hands still folded, his expression still patient. Waiting. Still waiting. With the serene, terrible confidence of a man who believed that his plan was bigger than tonight's setback. Harry felt it, without looking. He could feel the patience the way you feel a cold draft under a door, and he filed it away. He walked out. The corridor was dark and cool. McGonagall's tartan slippers were audible on the flagstones ahead. Hermione appeared at his shoulder. The Hufflepuff document, she said quietly. The counter-ritual. Yes. We need to understand it before anyone else gets to it. Yes. And the Class 7 file. The Department of Mysteries thing about your mother's heritage. Yes. A pause. Their footsteps. Harry. Neville's voice from just behind. My gran, she's on the Wizengamot. She hates Dumbledore. Harry glanced back at him. In the torchlight, Neville's face had found something that had perhaps not been there before this evening, a steadiness that came from having attached himself to a cause larger than his own terror. "That's useful," Harry said. "I thought so." "Also," Neville said, after a moment, "your family vault has a library. With restricted books." A pause. "I just thought that was worth mentioning." Hermione made a sound that was probably meant to be neutral. "An excellent mention," Harry said. They reached the third-floor guest room. McGonagall unlocked it and held the door, and the room inside was plain but clean, a bed, a writing desk, windows that looked out over the grounds where the lake caught moonlight. "I'll have the house elves bring bedding for your friends," McGonagall said. "If they're staying." "They're staying," Harry said. She nodded. She stood in the doorway for a moment, this woman who had shepherded 39 years of sorting ceremonies and believed, on most days, that the system she served was fundamentally good, and who had spent the last hour having that belief disassembled piece by careful piece. "In 35 years of teaching," she said, and her voice was very controlled, "I have never seen a sorting hat refuse to sort a child." She looked at Harry. "I have also never seen a child handle an evening like this one with," she stopped. Started again. "I failed you tonight, Mr. Potter. The school failed you tonight. I intend to do something about that." "I know," Harry said simply. She left. The door closed. Harry sat on the edge of the bed with the folder of documents in his lap. Outside, the lake shone. The sky was full of stars. Hermione sat at the writing desk, already opening her copy of the folder's contents. Neville took the window seat again, because apparently window seats were his territory now, and settled in with the Hufflepuff document that Ragnarok had let them take a secondary copy of. "Right," Hermione said, without looking up. "The Hufflepuff counter-ritual. The Bloodline seal. The Class 7 file. The behavioral compulsions coming off tomorrow." She turned a page. "We have a lot to do." "We do," Harry agreed. "Where do you want to start?" He looked at the folder. At his parents' wills, which he'd folded back into their vellum carefully, which he planned to read again, slowly, when the room was quiet. At his mother's handwriting, small and straight, saying "My son is not a weapon. With what we know," he said. "And then we build from there." Outside, the September wind moved across the lake and the stars were clear and the castle was old and full of secrets, and Harry Potter had just started the slow, deliberate work of learning them all. He wasn't afraid. That was the remarkable thing about this evening, through all of it, through the hat and the hall and the 43 and the wills and Dumbledore standing by the fireplace confirming, calmly, that yes, you were always meant to die, through all of it, he hadn't been afraid. "Awake," he'd said to Hermione in the corridor. Like a light had been turned on. He pulled out his parents' wills and read them again, slowly, and let himself feel what was in them, the love in his father's unruly handwriting, the precision and fierce protectiveness in his mother's. Let himself feel that they had existed. That they had known him. That they had written him into a document and trusted it to reach him, and it had, 9 years late and by a route nobody had planned, but it had. The clock on the desk ticked. Hermione turned pages. Neville squinted at archaic Founderera script. The night moved around them, and in the morning there would be healers and removed compulsions and a hall full of students with questions and a headmaster recalibrating his plans, but right now there was just the room and the documents and the friends who had decided without hesitation to stay. Harry read his mother's words one more time, "My son is not a weapon. He is a child." He let himself be both things, the child she'd meant, and the person he was becoming. Then he set the will down gently and picked up the Hufflepuff document, and said to Neville, "What have you got?" And they got to work. Chapter 3, What the Fire Remembers. The first compulsion came off at 7 in the morning. Healer Stroud arrived with 2 colleagues, a young man named Healer Baines who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult work long enough to stop performing it, and an older woman named Healer Okeke whose specialty, Stroud explained, was specifically layered magical interference on developing cores. They came in through the third-floor corridor with their cases and their pale diagnostic wands, and they found Harry already awake, sitting at the writing desk with his parents' folder open and a cup of tea that McGonagall had sent up via house elf going cold beside him. Hermione was asleep on the conjured cot by the window, her hair spread across the pillow, the Hufflepuff document still loose in her fingers. Neville had fallen asleep in the window seat sometime around 2 in the morning with his head against the glass, and the dawn had painted the side of his face in shades of amber and grey. Harry closed the folder when the healers came in, but not quickly. Not the way you close something you don't want seen. Just, done for now. He stood up and held out his hand to Strout, and she shook it like he was a colleague, which he appreciated. "How do you feel?" she asked. "The same," he said. "But I slept well, which is unusual." She made a note. "You've probably been experiencing disrupted sleep for years. One of the behavioral compulsions specifically suppresses the kind of deep, restorative sleep that the magical body needs to process core development. It was likely applied early. You've been running at a deficit." She set her case on the desk and opened it. "We'll take the behavioral compulsions first. 8 of them. Today we'll remove the first 3, which are the most actively disruptive, the compliance shaping, the self-minimization anchor, and the sleep suppressor. Removing all 8 at once risks your nervous system reinterpreting emotional responses faster than you can track them." "Meaning what?" Harry asked. "Meaning you might cry in the middle of a corridor and not know why," Baines said, and his voice was matter-of-fact enough that it didn't sound like a warning, just information. "Better to do it in stages." "Right." Harry sat in the chair Strout had positioned in the center of the room. Hermione had woken at the sound of the door and was now sitting up on her cot with her knees pulled to her chest, watching. Neville had startled awake and was blinking, confused, at the healers, then at Harry, then at the window, conducting a rapid private assessment of the situation. "This will take about 20 minutes per compulsion," Strout said. "I'll explain as I go. Ask questions if you have them. Don't try to anticipate what you'll feel, just let it happen." She raised the diagnostic wand and began. The first compulsion, the compliance shaping, came off like a hand releasing a grip Harry hadn't known was on him. The closest thing he could compare it to was the feeling of walking through a door into a larger room. Not dramatic. Just suddenly, undeniably more space. He sat in the chair and breathed and felt the edges of himself extend outward about 2 inches in every direction and thought, "Oh, so that's what I am." The second one, self-minimization, took longer. Strout's wand worked in slow, deliberate circles and Healer Okeke had her hands raised in a steadying posture nearby, and what came off this one was more complicated, because the self-minimization compulsion was woven into things that were also genuinely him. Strout had warned him about this. "Some of the behavioral ones are deeply integrated," she'd said. "They'll feel personal when they release, because they've been sitting on top of your actual responses for so long they've become part of the architecture. Don't confuse what comes off for something you're losing. Think of it as clearing sediment. What came off it was, not rage, exactly. Not immediately. It was more like the precondition for rage. The sudden awareness that certain things had been done to him that deserved to be responded to, that his habitual non-response was not equanimity but suppression, and that the non-response was not his. It sat in his chest like an ember. Not burning yet. Just there. The third, the sleep suppressor, left him briefly, intensely exhausted and then, 30 seconds later, more alert than he'd felt in his life. Healer Baines noticed the alert phase and checked his eyes and said, "Your magical core is already responding. It's trying to recalibrate." He sounded pleased in the understated way of someone who didn't get pleased often. "Your reserves are going to climb quite quickly once the suppression stack starts coming down." "How quickly?" Hermione asked from the cot. "Hard to say. His baseline is exceptional. The suppressions are the only reason his first-year accidental magic wasn't." Baines stopped, reconsidered, and said, "More dramatic." "More dramatic than what?" Harry asked. Baines looked at Strout. Strout said, without inflection, your core reads, even suppressed, in the top 5th percentile of any wizard I've assessed. Unsuppressed, she paused. We'll know more as the blocks come off. But the core's initial response to the first 3 removals is very strong. Harry considered that. Good, he said, without particular ego in it. Just, good. Neville, who had been watching from the window seat with his hands around a mug of tea a house elf had brought him without being asked, said quietly, does anyone check other children? For this kind of thing. For blocks. Strout looked at him. A full diagnostic like last night's is normally requested by the patient or their guardian. It's not standard practice at sorting. Should it be? Neville asked. A small silence. Strout looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. In my professional opinion, it should be standard at every intake. Neville nodded, absorbing this, filing it somewhere. Harry watched him do it and recognized the look of someone learning that a system they trusted has a specific gap in it, and beginning the quiet, personal calculation of what to do with that knowledge. The healers packed their cases. Strout scheduled the next session for 2 days' time. The magical core needed the interval to adjust. She gave Harry a list of things to watch for, a short document on what the remaining blocks were and in what order they planned to address them, and a small file of something pale blue that she described as, essentially a magical core stabilizer. It'll help your body process the changes in the gaps between sessions. After they left, Harry stood in the center of the room and did something he hadn't planned to do. He reached out, without a wand, and lit the fireplace. Not dramatically. Just reached, the way you reach for a light switch, with the casual expectation that the thing will respond, and it did. A curl of wandless fire caught in the grate and grew, and Harry looked at his hand and then at the fire and thought, that's new. Or rather, not new. Old. Just, uncovered. Oh, said Hermione. Yes, said Harry. She was on her feet now, standing with her arms crossed, studying him with an expression that was partly academic fascination and partly something warmer and less categorizable. Can you feel the difference? She asked. From yesterday? It's like, he tried to find language for it. Yesterday everything was at the end of a long corridor. My magic, I mean. I could get to it but I had to reach. Now it's just, here. He looked at the fire. It's just here. Wandless magic at 11, Neville said, from the window seat, with the tone of someone updating a comprehensive mental file. Unsuppressed. Wandless magic with a functional wand nearby, Harry pointed out. I've had accidental magic my whole life. This is just, on purpose. Still, Neville said. They went down to breakfast. The great hall was a different animal in the morning. The enchanted ceiling showed a soft overcast sky, grey and diffuse, and the tables were full of the particular noise of students who had spent the night processing something and were not done. Every head turned when Harry walked in. He noticed this and made no adjustment, didn't speed up, didn't slow down, didn't look at the floor. He walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down, and Hermione sat beside him, and Neville sat across from them, and he reached for the toast. Ron Weasley materialized at his elbow. Right, Ron said, sitting down with the directness of someone who had rehearsed an opening and decided against all the versions he'd prepared. I'm not going to say something stupid like, sorry about last night, because you clearly don't want pity. But I want to know if, he stopped. Tried again. Are you all right? Getting better, Harry said. Toast. Ron took the toast. This appeared to settle something for him, because he relaxed about 4 degrees and said, what's going to happen? To Dumbledore, I mean. My mum, I sent an owl this morning. He seemed to be choosing his word, incandescent. Tell her I said thank you, Harry said. She'll probably come and feed you herself, Ron said, with the mix of affection and resigned embarrassment of every eldest child describing their mother. Look, she's very much a children should be protected type of person. When she heard about the Dursleys, he shook his head. There were words I didn't know she knew. Across the hall, the Slytherin table was having its own morning. Harry caught fragments of a conversation between a dark-haired fifth year and her companion, not the words, just the tone, the specific register of people recalculating where their bets lie. Draco Malfoy was at the end of the table, eating with the careful composure of someone performing composure, and when Harry glanced at him, Malfoy met his eyes with an expression that was complicated in ways 11-year-olds rarely manage. Not hostile exactly. More like someone standing at a junction and understanding that both roads lead somewhere they hadn't mapped. Harry held the look for a moment, then returned to his breakfast. McGonagall appeared at 9 o'clock. She came to the Gryffindor table with the brisk authority of a woman who had slept 4 hours and made productive use of the other 5, and she placed a folded piece of parchment in front of Harry without preamble. "That is a formal letter," she said, "from myself to the Board of Governors, requesting an emergency meeting. It goes out today. I've also sent letters to Madame Longbottom," she glanced at Neville, "your grandmother will receive it this afternoon, and to 3 members of the Wizengamot who I believe will be relevant." She looked at Harry steadily. "I want you to know what I'm doing." "Thank you," Harry said. "Can I ask something?" "Yes." "The defense professor this year." Quirrell. A pause. McGonagall's expression didn't change but something tightened in it, very slightly, like a drum skin. "What about him?" "He has a very strong dark magic signature. I noticed it last night. I've been noticing it since I met him in the Leaky Cauldron." He looked at her. "That's not something every 11-year-old can detect." "I know that. I'm telling you because you should know, and because whatever is in the sealed vault on the 3rd floor, Mr. Potter, the one past the 3-headed dog," Harry said. He said it without drama, the way he'd said most things this morning, just information on the table. "I noticed it when we passed that corridor. There's something significant behind that door. And there's a man who smells of dark magic teaching in this school." He paused. "I don't know what the plan was supposed to be. But I'm telling you now, in the daylight, so that you know I know." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him last night in her office, that expression that was still learning its own shape, still working out what the appropriate feeling was for this particular situation. "The vault," she said carefully, "is protected by the school's faculty and is not your concern." "I understand," Harry said. "I'm just telling you what I've noticed." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned and walked away with the same brisk authority she'd arrived with, and Harry watched her go and thought that she was going to have a conversation with Dumbledore today that was going to be worth observing. The morning classes were something. Harry was not formally sorted. The hat, which had apparently maintained its position, had told McGonagall that it would complete the remaining sorting the following day and that Mr. Potter's sorting would take place when he was ready, and since nobody in the administration seemed prepared to argue with a magical artifact that had just had its most significant ceremony in 1,000 years, Harry was in a state of institutional limbo. He attended first-year classes with Hermione and Neville simply because they went and he followed, and nobody stopped him. He sat through Transfiguration, McGonagall's class, where she made a brief and pointed reference to yesterday's unusual circumstances that shut down any commentary from the other students with surgical precision, and through Charms, where Flitwick spent the first 10 minutes of the class looking at Harry with barely contained intellectual excitement before apparently forcing himself to teach the scheduled lesson. Harry produced the Wingardium Leviosa charm on his first attempt, which he noted and didn't comment on. Hermione produced it 3 seconds later, which she also didn't comment on, but her eyes were bright. It was in the corridor between Charms and their next class that Draco Malfoy appeared. He came with the 2 large boys who would apparently be his permanent geographic contacts throughout his Hogwarts career, but he stopped them with a gesture before he reached Harry, which meant whatever this was, he decided it was a conversation rather than a performance. Harry recognized the distinction and waited. "Potter," Malfoy said. "Malfoy," Harry said. A pause. Malfoy was clearly working through something. His face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking harder than he wanted anyone to see, which Harry had identified as a tell within about 30 seconds of meeting him. My father, Malfoy said, carefully, was on the board that denied 3 of your Gringotts meetings. I know, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him. He didn't know about the will specifically. I don't think he knew. Did he know about the blocks? Harry asked. A shorter pause. Some of them. The financial ones. My father and Dumbledore they have an arrangement. An understanding. About how things work. He seemed to taste the words as he said them and find them not entirely to his liking. I thought you should know that I know. Thank you, Harry said. Malfoy blinked. It was clearly not what he'd expected. Why are you telling me? Harry asked. Not suspicious. Genuinely curious. Because, Malfoy said, and something in him went very briefly, very honestly younger than the performance he usually maintained. Last night was the first time I've watched something happen and not known what my father would want me to think about it. He recovered quickly, pulling the performance back around himself like a robe. That's all. Harry looked at him for a moment. If you work out what you actually think, he said, let me know. Malfoy studied him, performed a quick, complex calculation behind his grey eyes, and then inclined his head in a way that had nothing to do with his father's politics and walked away. Hermione, who had watched the entire exchange from 2 feet to Harry's left, said, that was surprising. People are, Harry said, and they went to their next class. The real shift happened that afternoon. McGonagall appeared at the door of the library, where Harry and Hermione and Neville had staked out a corner table. They'd arrived to find Madame Pants already placing a reserved sign on the table, which had been either McGonagall's doing or the library's own form of hospitality, and either way they accepted it. Harry had the Hufflepuff document open in the center of the table, and Hermione had 3 books open around it, and Neville had a quill and a very organized set of notes that suggested he'd been awake until 4 in the morning processing what they'd learned. McGonagall closed the library door behind her, looked at the arrangement of books and documents, and then did something that surprised all 3 of them. She sat down. Not stood over the table. Sat down. In the 4th chair. Like a participant. Show me what you have, she said. Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he turned the Hufflepuff document to face her. She read it in silence. She was a fast reader, her eyes moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been consuming dense academic text for 6 decades, and her expression as she read it moved through stages that were interesting to watch. First careful neutrality, then sharpening focus, then the particular stillness of someone who has understood something significant. A counter-ritual, she said. A specific one, Hermione said, leaning forward. Professor, the binding in Harry's scar is a variant of what the Founders classified as a Horcrux-adjacent construction. It's not a Horcrux exactly, it was created by accident, but the magical mechanics are similar enough that the standard Horcrux dissolution rituals wouldn't work on it without modification. What Hufflepuff documented is a ritual that separates a parasitic soul fragment from a living host without requiring the host's death. She developed it in the context of a different conflict, but the applications are. She stopped herself. Sorry. I've been reading for a while. Don't apologize, McGonagall said. Continue. The ritual requires 3 things, Neville said, which surprised everyone including himself, because he'd been the quiet one, but his notes were comprehensive. A magical anchor, something connected to the host's original bloodline, ideally something created before the binding was placed. A witness of significant power who can hold the container for the displaced fragment. She describes it as a soul catcher. It's basically a reinforced magical vessel. And a specific incantation that has to be spoken by the host themselves. He looked at Harry. You have to speak it. What language? Harry asked. Neville looked at his notes. Old English, mostly. But there are 3 lines in what Hermione thinks might be Proto-Parseltongue. A silence. Parseltongue, McGonagall said. She was looking at Harry. I speak it, Harry said. Most people believe Parseltongue is exclusively inherited through the Slytherin line, she said carefully. Most people are probably right, Harry said. But the hat said my bloodline is complicated. And Healer Strout said the Evans line has markers that don't fit standard Muggle-born classification. He paused. I don't know yet what I am. But I know what I can do. As if to demonstrate, or not to demonstrate, just to confirm what he'd said, he looked at the old Hufflepuff document and said, quietly, 3 syllables that were not English or Latin or any language with a conventional alphabet, but that moved through the air of the library like water moves through water, naturally and without effort. The document glowed faintly along its archaic script. 3 lines, deep in the lower half of the page, pulsed gold and went still. Hermione stared at it. Those are the 3 lines, she said. You just said the 3 lines. From the ritual. Correctly. I could read them, Harry said simply. McGonagall was very still. She looked at the document, at the fading glow, at Harry with an expression that was not quite identifiable but occupied the same territory as the look she'd given him last night, the look of someone continuously revising their model of a situation. Right, she said. And then she did another surprising thing. She placed her own hands flat on the table, looked at all 3 of them, and said, I'm going to teach you something. All 3 of you. Not the curriculum. Something older. She glanced at the closed library door. The founders built several things into this school that aren't in the lesson plans. Structural enchantments. Wards. Communication networks between the major magical anchors of the building. Salazar Slytherin built one into the chamber below. Godric Gryffindor built one into the sword. Rowena Ravenclaw built one into the diadem, lost now, probably. Helga Hufflepuff, she looked at the document, built one into the kitchens and the hospital wing, designed to detect when students were in physical danger and respond. And you're telling us this because, Hermione began. Because the Hufflepuff network, McGonagall said, is also connected to the Vault archives. The sub-archives. The ones that aren't in any library catalog. She looked at Harry. Your family is very old, Mr. Potter. Ragnarok was right. And if your family had dealings with the founders, which the presence of that document in your family vault strongly suggests, there may be other documents. Other archives. Things that were deposited specifically because someone anticipated that they'd be needed. By me, Harry said. By whoever came next, McGonagall said. Which appears to be you. She pulled her wand out and performed a complex sequence of taps on the library table, not a spell Harry recognized, something longer and more layered, with pauses in it that felt deliberate rather than hesitant. The table's surface shimmered briefly, and in the wood grain, very faintly, like reading text through water, a pattern appeared. Lines connecting points, the geometric signature of a ward network. This, she said, is how Hogwarts actually works. Not the way it's explained to first years. The deeper layer. She looked at Harry. I'm showing you this because Dumbledore knows this layer intimately and has been using it for 60 years, and because you are going to need to understand the ground you're standing on. She taught them for 2 hours. Not theory. Not history. Practical working knowledge of Hogwarts as a magical organism, the way the wards layered, the way the building responded to intent, the way certain rooms changed function based on need, the way the school's inherent magic could be accessed by someone who knew its original structure. It was not the sort of thing taught in any class. It was the sort of thing passed between people who trusted each other with infrastructure. Harry absorbed it the way he was absorbing everything today, with the focused, uncluttered attention of someone whose cognitive blocks were 3/4 off, whose natural memory was beginning to assert itself, whose mind was moving the way it was apparently always meant to move. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. He looked at the patterns McGonagall drew on the table, understood them, and they stayed. Your memory, Hermione said, at some point during the session, to Harry, in an undertone. She was watching him absorb the 4th ward diagram in a row without writing anything down. Is it, different today, he said quietly. Yes. The eidetic block, she said. The diagnostic had flagged it, a suppression on his recall architecture, keeping his memory functional but not extraordinary. It must be starting to clear with the compulsions. He nodded. He looked at the ward diagram McGonagall had drawn and could read every intersection, every anchor point, every flow channel, as naturally as reading a sentence. He thought about 10 years of struggling in school, of being told he was average, of working twice as hard as Dudley to understand things that Dudley managed by accident, and the ember in his chest from this morning glowed a degree hotter. Not yet. There would be time for anger. McGonagall finished the session by handing each of them a single sheet of parchment, handwritten, her own hand, the cramped precise script of a woman who took record-keeping seriously. That, she said, is a list of the wards you can interact with directly. Your magical signature is already keyed to some of them, Harry. The school recognized you when you walked through the door, as it recognizes all Potter blood. The others you'll need to key yourself. The process is in the second paragraph. Harry looked at the list. 11 wards. 3 of them had small notations beside them in a different color ink. These 3, he said, pointing. Those 3, McGonagall said, were placed by Dumbledore after he took the position of headmaster. They override several of the original founder protocols. She met his eyes. I'm telling you that because you should know what's been changed. I am not telling you to remove them. Understood, Harry said. She collected her things and stood. At the door she paused. She was doing this, he noticed, pausing at exits, as if the threshold gave her an interval for last things. Sirius Black, she said, without turning around. I've submitted an inquiry to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Requesting documentation of trial proceedings. A pause. I was surprised to discover that there are none. She left. Harry sat with his friends in the quiet library and looked at the parchment. We need to talk about Quirrell, Neville said, after a moment. Yes, Harry said. And the vault on the 3rd floor. Yes. And the fact that Dumbledore put a stone in this school that Voldemort very much wants, with an obstacle course that a talented first year could navigate, because, Neville paused, and his voice had the quality of someone finishing a thought they found unpleasant, because a talented first year was always meant to navigate it. Hermione looked at Neville with an expression that was partly impressed. That's a significant inference. I've had a very educational 12 hours, Neville said simply. Harry looked at him, at Neville, who had been shuffled onto the window seat last night because nobody had given him a chair, who had spent his whole life being told he barely qualified for the name he carried, who had brought organized notes to this morning's library session and had just laid out a structural analysis of Dumbledore's plan with the flat precision of someone who'd been thinking harder than anyone had given him credit for. Neville, Harry said. Yeah. Has anyone ever told you that you're useless? Often. I was going to say sharp, Harry said. Neville blinked. Looked at his notes. Then back at Harry. Something in his face did something complicated and arrived at a new arrangement, something that had not been the face he'd worn when he'd climbed onto the window seat last night. No, he said. Not really. Well, Harry said, and moved on, because he'd meant it as an observation and not a moment, and drawing attention to it would make it small. He tapped the parchment. The vault. The stone. Quirrell. If Dumbledore's plan was for me to navigate to the stone and have some pivotal confrontation with Voldemort, which is a reasonable reading of everything we know, then the confrontation was meant to be the test. The crucible. The thing that would have activated the ritual in my scar. Not immediately, Hermione said, thinking it through. The hat said the ritual requires Voldemort at full strength. Quirrell is a host, not full strength, Harry agreed. But a rehearsal. The first encounter, meant to establish the pattern. Meant to make me think of Voldemort as someone I can face alone, without backup, in a dramatic moment. He leaned back in his chair. Acclimatization. Dumbledore was building my comfort with the idea of walking into danger. The three of them sat with that. So we don't go to the third floor, Neville said. We go, Harry said. Just not the way we were meant to. There's a difference? Hermione asked. The way we were meant to go is alone, in response to a crisis, probably at night, probably convinced we have no choice. He looked at the ward diagram. Going on our own terms, in the daylight, with a plan, with witnesses, and with the explicit intention of removing the stone from a school full of children before Quirrell has a chance to act, that's different. McGonagall, Hermione said. McGonagall, Harry confirmed. And Sprout, if she'll come. And Ragnarok, because the stone is a Gringotts object. It was stolen from Gringotts, Neville said, and then blinked at his own notes. Vault 713. The break-in. July 31st. The same day Hagrid took me to Gringotts, Harry said. Hagrid retrieved something from that vault. We went there together. He took the stone, or whatever was in the vault, on Dumbledore's orders. Hermione was already writing. Her quill moved with the rapid, decisive strokes of someone who thought faster than most people moved. So Dumbledore moved the stone from Gringotts, where it was safe, to Hogwarts. Created the obstacle course. Waited. And seeded information, Harry said. Neville's right. A talented first year would navigate it. The Mirror of Erised, there's a mirror in there, Dumbledore mentioned it to the staff. I heard him in the corridor Tuesday morning before classes. It's the final obstacle. It's keyed to desire, specifically designed so that someone who wants to use the stone can't retrieve it. Only someone who wants to find it but not use it. He looked at his friends. Someone pure of heart. Someone brave and self-sacrificing and not interested in power. He let the word sit. Someone, Hermione said slowly, exactly like the version of you he was building. Yes. He designed the obstacle course for you, she said. Not just to protect the stone. The obstacles they were each calibrated to your specific skill set. Chess, Ron, Harry said. Ron is extraordinary at chess. Chess would be Ron's obstacle, not mine. Potion's logic is yours. The flying obstacle, he stopped. There's a broom component. I can already fly. I've been flying since I could get on a broom in the Dursleys' back garden. That's not an obstacle for me, that's a clear path. The library was very quiet around them. He needed you to succeed, Neville said. All the way through. Right to the mirror. He looked at Harry. He needed you to reach the end. And the end wasn't getting the stone, Harry said. The end was Voldemort. The confrontation. The first time. They sat with this for a moment. Then Harry stood up, gathered the Hufflepuff document and his folder, and tucked them under his arm with the businesslike efficiency of someone who has assessed a situation and decided on a response. I'm going to write to Ragnarok tonight, he said. The stone needs to go back to Gringotts. Tomorrow, if possible. I'll also write to Augusta Longbottom, he glanced at Neville, with your permission. She already knows I'm here, Neville said. The letter from McGonagall went this afternoon. Gran, she'll come in person. She doesn't trust owls for anything important. Good. Harry looked at Hermione. The Class 7 file. The one Croaker mentioned. Your parents' heritage, the Department of Mysteries seal. How do we access it? Hermione looked slightly dangerous, which was a look she developed over the course of this evening and which suited her considerably. A formal petition for record access can be filed by a direct descendant, she said. Which would be you. It triggers a mandatory disclosure review under the Family Magic Preservation Act of 1923, which Dumbledore apparently helped write, which means he knows every mechanism for blocking it, but it also means Croaker has to respond within 14 days by law. The Unspeakables don't like being in breach of their own statutes. I'll write that tonight too, Harry said. I'll draft it, Hermione said. Legal language. I've been reading Wizarding Inheritance Law since July. She said it without self-consciousness, the way you'd mention any reasonable preparation for a new environment. Harry looked at her. Since July. I didn't know what I was walking into, she said. I like to know what I'm walking into. He smiled, a real one, the unguarded kind, quick and genuine. Me too, he said. They left the library as the light through the castle's high windows was going golden, late afternoon, the September sun angled and warm, turning the stones from gray to amber. Students were moving through the corridors in the post-class drift toward dinner, and Harry walked among them without hurrying, without the crowd anxiety the behavioral compulsions had apparently been generating in him for years. It was remarkable, he thought, how much of his own fear had not been his. He passed the third-floor corridor and felt the wrongness of the vault beyond it, dark magic and something older, something desperate, pressing against the wards like a hand against a window. He noted it, catalogued it, and walked on. Not now. Not tonight. On his terms, with his people, with a plan. In the great hall, dinner was in progress. The noise was enormous, 12 years of communal eating echoed in that ceiling, and the enchanted sky above was purple and gold as the sun set, and somewhere up at the head table Dumbledore was sitting with his hands folded and his expression whatever it needed to be. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and served himself and talked with Ron about Quidditch in the easy way of two people who had decided to simply get along, and across from him Hermione and Neville had their heads bent over Neville's notes, and the hall moved around them in its ordinary extraordinary way. And two things happened, almost simultaneously, as the sun finished setting and the enchanted ceiling shifted from purple to deep blue. The first, the Sorting Hat, sitting on its stool at the front of the hall where it had remained since the night before, turned toward Harry and said something that no one else seemed to hear, a murmur, just for him, cutting through all the hall noise with the particular directness of old magic. The fire in the Founder's Archive, it said. It remembers you. Go tonight. Alone first. Let it show you what it kept. Harry looked at the hat. Nodded, once, almost imperceptibly. The second thing, an owl arrived. Not a school owl, a huge, dark bird with the Gringotts seal on its leg, dropping a package into Harry's hands before wheeling away. He opened it under the table. Inside was a small flat stone, smooth and dark, with a stylized G worked into its surface, and a folded note from Ragnarok. Mr. Potter. Your access token, keyed to your bloodline signature. Point it at any Gringotts registered vault door and speak your name. We have also taken the liberty of initiating a review of the events of November 1st, 1981, pertaining to the placement of a specific artifact. We will be in touch within 48 hours. Ragnarok. P.S. Your grandmother's portrait in the primary vault says to tell you she's been waiting for you to visit. Harry read that last line twice. Then folded the note, pocketed the stone, and looked at the deep blue ceiling with its scattered early stars. His grandmother's portrait. In a vault he'd never been allowed to access. He would go to the Founder's Archive tonight, as the hat had suggested. He would follow the fire that remembered him. And in the morning he would write every letter he'd planned, and the healers would come and take off 3 more blocks, and Ragnarok's review would send ripples through the ministry that Dumbledore could not redirect with politely worded scheduling conflicts. And at some point in the near future, soon, on his terms, in front of witnesses, he was going to have the second conversation with Dumbledore. The one where he did all the talking. But first, the fire. The hall hummed around him. Hermione kicked his foot under the table without looking up from her notes, a light tap, a question mark. He kicked back. I'm fine. She returned to her notes. He returned to his dinner. Outside, the stars came out one by one. Chapter 4, The Shape of a Trap. The Founder's Archive was not on any map. Harry knew this because Hermione had obtained every map of Hogwarts available through the library, official ones, supplementary ones, one very old one that Madame Pants had retrieved from a locked cabinet with the reluctant expression of someone lending a first edition, and none of them showed anything on the sub-basement level that the Sorting Hat had indicated. The level existed. The staircase to reach it was behind a tapestry on the 4th floor that depicted 3 wizards arguing about the correct method of dragon taming, and the staircase itself was narrow and wound downward in a tight spiral, and at the bottom was a short corridor that ended in a wall. Just a wall. Stone, old, unremarkable. Harry stood in front of it at 11 o'clock at night with a wand light held low and the Gringotts access token warm in his pocket and thought about what McGonagall had taught them about the school as a living thing, about wards that responded to intent, about original architecture that predated every administrative modification Dumbledore had installed above it. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. Nothing visible happened. But something he could feel did. The wall breathed against his hand, or something that wasn't quite breathing but occupied the same register, and then a door was simply there, swung inward on hinges that made no sound, and beyond it was a low orange-amber light that smelled of old wood and something else, something sharp and mineral, like struck flint. The archive was a single room. Circular, low-ceilinged, lined floor to ceiling with shelves that held not books exactly but containers, stone boxes, sealed files, rolled scrolls in leather cases, flat tiles of what looked like fired clay with text pressed into them, small locked chests with symbols on their lids that Harry recognized from the Hufflepuff document. In the center of the room was a basin. Stone, shallow, about the width of a large dinner plate, and in it a fire burned that was not quite the color of ordinary fire. It was deeper in the orange, touched with gold and occasionally, in the lower part of the flame, something almost copper. Harry stood at the threshold for a moment, taking it in. Then he stepped through and the door closed behind him and the fire in the basin turned to look at him. He understood, rationally, that fires did not look at things. He experienced, physically and without ambiguity, being looked at by this fire. It was not threatening. It was the feeling of being recognized by something very old and very attentive, the feeling of mattering to something that had been waiting to matter to you. He crossed to the basin and sat down on the low stone bench that curved around it. The fire's light moved across his face. He thought about what the hat had said. It remembers you. Not, it will tell you things. Not, there are answers here. It remembers you, specifically, the way the things that loved your parents remember you. Hello, he said, feeling only slightly ridiculous. The fire shifted. A tendril of flame extended upward and then outward and touched the edge of the basin, and where it touched, an image appeared in the stone, not a projection, not a photograph, just a momentary shaping of light and shadow that resolved into 2 figures. A man and a woman, young and laughing about something, moving in the particular way of people who are unaware they're being observed. His parents. He sat with that for a moment. The fire showed them to him for about 30 seconds, just a fragment, a moment caught somehow in the stone and preserved by the archive's magic, his father's unruly dark hair and his mother's red, and the laugh, the specific quality of it, the ease and warmth, and then the image faded and the fire returned to its ordinary shape. Thank you, Harry said. The fire pulsed once. Then it began to do something different. From the shelves around the room, 3 containers drifted down without Harry touching them, moved by the archive's own volition, selected, presented. A stone box, a clay tile, and a scroll in a very old leather case. They arranged themselves on the bench beside him. He opened the stone box first. Inside, on a bed of something that looked like dried heather, was a wand. Not his wand, he touched the Hollyann Phoenix wand in his pocket and it was still there, warm and present. This wand was different. Older. Dark wood, almost black, with a very slight curve to it, about 10 inches, and at its tip a single silver rune carved into the wood. He recognized the rune from the Hufflepuff document. He didn't pick the wand up. He looked at it for a moment, closed the box, and moved to the clay tile. The tile was covered in pressed text, the same archaic script as the Hufflepuff document, but denser, more formal, the script of official records rather than personal research. He held it up to the fire's light and the Parseltongue sections illuminated themselves as the ones in the document had, glowing briefly, and he read them with the same ease as before. The rest he translated slowly, his Latin good enough to manage the older forms with effort. It was a record. A deposition, almost, the formal kind, the kind meant for archives and posterity. Dated in the 9th century. Signed with 4 names, 2 of which Harry recognized immediately. Helga Hufflepuff. Godric Gryffindor. The other 2 were their students, a witch and a wizard whose family names meant nothing to Harry immediately, but whose magical signatures were described in the record with a specificity that suggested they were significant. The record described a ritual they had performed, a sealing they had made, a lineage they had anchored to the school itself. He read the whole thing twice. When he got to the 3rd page, the clay tile was surprisingly large, the text covering both sides in tight columns. His hands stopped moving and he sat very still for a moment and then read the relevant paragraph 3 more times because the first 2 times he wasn't sure he was reading it correctly. He was reading it correctly. He set the tile down carefully and picked up the scroll. Inside the leather case the scroll was vellum, the same heavy, cold quality as his parents' wills, but significantly older, the vellum darkened to a deep cream by centuries. It unrolled to about 2 feet of text, and it was in English, not modern English, but something he could work through, and near the bottom someone had added a translation in a more recent hand, the ink still relatively dark, perhaps 200 years old. The recent annotation was signed, E.P. He stared at the initials for a moment. Then he rolled the scroll back up, returned all 3 items to the archive shelves, sat in front of the fire for about 10 minutes without doing anything, and then left. He found Hermione still awake, sitting at the writing desk in the guest room with 4 candles burning and 3 books open and her hair in a braid that was coming undone on one side, the look of someone who had been going too hard for too long and was too interested to stop. Neville was asleep. Harry came in without knocking, which was fine because he'd established early that the room was shared space, and sat down on the edge of the bed and put his elbows on his knees. Hermione looked at him. At his face. Set down her quill. "What did you find?" she asked. "My mother," he said, "was a descendant of Helga Hufflepuff." A silence. "Through her mother's line," he said. "Her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, the lineage goes straight back. The sealed Evans bloodline. The thing Croker's Class 7 file is about. Lily Evans wasn't Muggle-born. She was the latest in a line that had been marrying into Muggle families for 4 generations to protect themselves from exactly the kind of war that Voldemort started." He looked at Hermione. "And Hufflepuff's archive recognized my family's signature because my family has been depositing things there since the 10th century. Hermione opened her mouth, closed it, and said, "The wand." "Yes. The wand in the stone box, Helga Hufflepuff's wand," Harry said. "Archived by my family. For the heir." "You're the heir of Hufflepuff," Hermione said, and her voice was doing the thing it did when she was processing at maximum capacity, flat and rapid and stripped of inflection. "Along with, you're a Potter, which is an ancient line, and the Potters had, the clay tile, the Potters were founding students. Not founders themselves but, first generation. Godric Gryffindor taught the first Potter wizard. The magical compact between the families is documented in the archive going back to the school's founding. The Potter magical signature is specifically keyed to Gryffindor's magical framework." He paused. "Which is why the Sorting Hat wanted to put me in Gryffindor. Not because I'm brave, or not just because of that. Because my family's magic literally resonates with Gryffindor's. It's structural." "And the scroll?" Hermione asked. Harry was quiet for a moment. "The scroll is a record of what the founders knew about sacrificial magic. Specifically, about what they called a soul splinter. A fragment of a soul that attaches to a host through a violent magical event." He looked at his hands. They'd seen it before. Not the same circumstances but the same mechanism. And the record describes how it changes the host. He paused. "The Parseltongue. It's not my bloodline heritage, or not entirely. Part of it is from my mother's Hufflepuff descent. Hufflepuff had limited Parseltongue herself, it was more common before Slytherin made it his signature. But the fluency, the depth of it, that's the soul splinter. I absorbed part of Voldemort's magical signature when his curse rebounded. His Parseltongue is in me. Hermione looked at him. That's complicated, Harry said. Yes. And it means the counter-ritual is more important than we already thought, because the longer the splinter stays, the more his magical patterns embed into mine. He paused again. The scroll was annotated. Initials. EP. Hermione's face changed. Evans, presumably, he said. Someone in my mother's line, 200 years ago, knew about this mechanism. Added notes to the founder's record. Was in close enough contact with this archive to do it. He looked at Hermione. My mother knew. When she invoked the blood protection, the sacrifice, she wasn't just working on instinct. She knew. She understood the mechanics. She chose to weaponize the splinter mechanism, turn it back on Voldemort, make her own death the vehicle for his destruction. He stopped. She wasn't just protecting me. She was executing a plan. Hermione pressed her fingers over her mouth for a moment. It was one of her the thing she did when an emotion arrived that was too large for the analytical framework she'd been using and needed its own space. She was brilliant, Hermione said, quietly. Yes, Harry said. The ember in his chest again, but different this time, bigger, not the hot tight anger from this morning but something more complex, something that had grief and pride folded into it together, inseparable. And Dumbledore knew, Hermione said. About the Hufflepuff heritage. He filed the Class 7 seal in 1979, 2 years before your parents died. He knew your mother was the Hufflepuff heir. He knew the archive existed. He knew about the counter-ritual. He sealed all of it, Harry said. The bloodline record, the Class 7 file, the access to the family archive. He sealed my mother's actual magical identity from public record so that nobody could follow the thread. Because if anyone knew she was the Hufflepuff heir, if anyone knew the archive existed, if anyone looked at the counter-ritual, he stopped. They'd know the splinter could be removed without you dying, Hermione finished. They'd know the death walk was optional, Harry said. They'd know there was another way. And Dumbledore needed there to be only one way. His way. They looked at each other in the candlelight. Right, Hermione said. She picked up her quill. We need to move faster. She worked through the night on 4 letters simultaneously, which was, Harry reflected, an impressive feat of mental organization. He slept for 4 hours, deep and restorative in the way Strout had said he would once the sleep suppressor came off, no dreams or nightmares, just sleep, and woke at 5 feeling like he'd been running at reduced power his whole life and had just, for the first time, opened the throttle. His magic felt different again. Not dramatically different from yesterday but measurably so, the way a fire feels different when you add dry wood to it, the same fire but with more to work with. He lay in the grey pre-dawn light and felt it sitting in him like a warm engine and thought, 30% yesterday morning. Higher now, with 3 compulsions off. The suppression still layered on the core but already beginning to loosen at the edges. He got up and wrote his own letters. To Ragnarok, detailed, specific, requesting the stone removal be initiated through official channels today. To Augusta Longbottom, respectful, direct, explaining what he needed from her Wisengamot connections. To Healer Croker at the Department of Mysteries, Hermione had drafted this one and it was a legal instrument of some precision, citing 4 separate statutes, and Harry signed it and sealed it without changing a word. Then he wrote a personal note. Short. To Sirius Black, at Azkaban, marked urgent and legal, which Hermione had explained triggered a mandatory delivery protocol that the prison couldn't intercept. My name is Harry Potter. I've read my parents' wills. I know you're my godfather. I know you didn't have a trial. I'm working on it. Hold on. He looked at the note for a moment. Added, my mum wrote about you. She said your love for me was one of the truest things she'd witnessed. then sealed it before he could second-guess it. Neville woke at 6 and read Hermione's letters over breakfast. She'd written one on his behalf too, to Augusta, supplementing Harry's, and he read it with an expression that moved from touched to deeply impressed. "You wrote this on my behalf?" he said. "I hope that's all right," Hermione said. "It's better than anything I'd have written," Neville said. "Gran's going to love you. She doesn't know me." "She will," Neville said, with absolute certainty. The morning's second block removal session happened at 8. Healer Stroud arrived with Baines and Okeke, and they took off the next 3 behavioral compulsions, including the social anxiety suppressor and something Okeke classified as a confidence ceiling, a block specifically calibrated to prevent Harry from trusting his own assessments. When the confidence ceiling came off, it was different from the others. The others had felt like things lifting, like space opening. This one felt like waking up inside himself. Like a room he'd been living in for years suddenly revealed to have twice the floor space. He sat in the chair for a moment afterward and looked at Healer Okeke and said, "How long was that one on?" "From the layering pattern, approximately age 6, she said. She said it in the same clinical, unornamented voice that all healers seem to develop, but her eyes above her professional expression were angry, the specific anger of someone whose job is healing and who finds deliberate damage to be a personal offense. 6, Harry said. "Yes. Right," he said. He stood up. He didn't say anything else about it. But when he walked out of the guest room and into the corridor and Hermione was there asking about breakfast, he looked at her and said, "I want to go to the vault this weekend." "Gringotts? The primary vault?" "Yes. My grandmother's portrait. And the library sub-vault. I want to see what else is there." He paused. "And I want to see if Ragnarok has anything on my father's side. The Potter lineage. I keep thinking about the founding compact, the Gryffindor connection, and I want to know what that actually means in practical terms." "I'll write to Ragnarok today," Hermione said. "You don't have to do all the writing," Harry said. "I know," she said, in the tone of someone who was doing it because they wanted to, not because they'd been asked. "I like writing letters. It organizes my thoughts." They went to breakfast. The thing about Snape's class, potions, Thursday morning, Harry's first encounter with the man in an actual classroom context, was that Harry walked in knowing considerably more about Severus Snape than Snape knew he knew, and this produced an interesting dynamic. The dungeon was cold and dim and smelled of things that might have been pleasant individually but combined into something that qualified as aggressive. The class filed in and Snape was already there, at the front, standing very still in the way of a man who was always present before you arrived and always slightly ahead of wherever you thought he was. He did not look at Harry when Harry walked in. This was itself notable. Harry had been told, in the library, by Hermione, who had done background reading on all the professors, that Snape's hatred of James Potter was semi-legendary and that Harry should expect it to be redirected onto him. He had prepared himself for hostility. He had not prepared himself for careful, deliberate non-attention, which was a different and more interesting posture. Snape began his usual opening speech. The theatrical version, "I can teach you to bewitch the mind, ensnare the senses." Harry had heard it described by Percy Weasley over breakfast this morning. Percy described things in great sequential detail when given half an opening, and so he heard it with the mild interest of someone watching a practice performance. Then Snape's eyes landed on Harry for the first time, deliberately. "Potter," he said. "Our new celebrity." Harry met his gaze. "Professor." A microsecond of adjustment in Snape's expression, tiny, almost nothing, but Harry caught it. He'd expected the dismissal to land somewhere soft, somewhere defensive. It hadn't. "Tell me," Snape said, in the voice of someone preparing a trap, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry had read 1,000 magical herbs and fungi twice in the past 2 days, because his eidetic memory meant that once through was enough and twice was habit. He knew the answer. He also understood, from the context of everything he now knew about this man and his history, that Snape was choosing his questions carefully. Asphodel was associated in old magical folklore with mourning and apology. Wormwood with absence and regret. The question was a message addressed to someone else, sent through a first-year class. Draught of living death, Harry said. Asphodel and wormwood together produce one of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The asphodel needs to be powdered, not crushed. Crushing changes the compound structure and produces something considerably less useful. He paused. And in the language of flowers, it's considered a message of grief. Asphodel, my regrets follow you to the grave. Wormwood, absence. He held Snape's gaze. So the answer is technically a potion. But I suspect you knew that already. The dungeon was very quiet. 21st years held perfectly still in the way of people watching something they didn't entirely understand. Snape looked at Harry for a long moment. His expression had done something that was difficult to classify. It had not become warmer, exactly, but it had shed the specific theatrical hostility and replaced it with something more complicated. The look of a man encountering something unexpected and reassessing. Correct, he said. He moved on. He did not bother Harry for the rest of the class. After potions, Harry went back to the guest room and found something he hadn't expected, Augusta Longbottom. She was sitting in the tartan chair by the desk, Neville's grandmother, a formidable witch in a magnificent hat with a stuffed vulture on it, a woman whose facial expression had been calibrated over many decades to communicate displeasure at a range of 100 feet. She was sitting upright with her handbag on her knees and she was looking at the room with the expression of someone who had arrived with something to say and intended to say it. Neville was standing near the window seat doing an impression of someone at parade rest. Harry Potter, Augusta said, before Harry had fully come through the door. Mrs. Longbottom, Harry said. He came the rest of the way in and closed the door behind him. She looked at him. She had sharp eyes, dark, assessing, the eyes of someone who had survived decades of Wizengamot politics by seeing accurately. She looked at Harry with them and whatever she saw appeared to either confirm or revise something she'd expected. Sit down, she said. He sat. I received 2 letters this morning, she said. From my grandson and from a Hermione Granger, who writes with remarkable legal precision for a first year. I also received an unofficial communication from Minerva McGonagall, who has been one of the few people in this country I unconditionally trust for 30 years. And I have received, she paused, a copy of your parents' wills, forwarded by Gringotts with the particular urgency that institution reserves for situations where they feel they have been made to look bad. She opened her handbag and removed a sheaf of documents. I have been on the Wizengamot for 41 years, Mr. Potter. I have voted against Albus Dumbledore's proposals 46 times. I have been outvoted 45 of those times. She looked at him steadily. I have been waiting, for most of those 41 years, for an occasion when outvoting was not the only option available to me. I think that occasion has arrived, Harry said. I think it has, she agreed. I have spoken with 4 sympathetic Wizengamot members already this morning. I have initiated a formal inquiry into the non-trial of Sirius Black, which under Section 17 of the Wizengamot Charter requires a full bench review within 30 days. I have submitted a request to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for all documentation pertaining to the placement of a minor in non-designated guardianship, which is, a breach of the Family Magic Preservation Act, Harry said. Augusta blinked. Then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but occupied adjacent territory. Yes, she said. It is. I also know, Harry said, that there's a philosopher's stone in this school that shouldn't be here, that a professor is currently hosting a remnant of Voldemort's soul, and that the obstacles between the stone and the general student population are specifically designed to be navigable by a capable first year, which was never really about protecting the stone at all. He looked at her. I'd like the stone removed today or tomorrow, if that's something your Wizengamot contacts can facilitate with Gringotts. Augusta looked at him for what was, objectively, a fairly long time. Neville, she said, without looking at her grandson. Yes, Gran. You chose well, she said. Neville made a small, slightly overwhelmed sound from the window seat. Augusta produced a further sheaf of documents from her apparently inexhaustible handbag. I've taken the liberty of filing an emergency injunction to temporarily suspend Dumbledore's authority over decisions regarding your welfare. It's narrow in scope, specifically your medical care and guardianship situation, but it creates a legal buffer. He cannot prevent the healer's work or the Gringotts audit while it's in force. She looked at Harry. That took me 4 hours and caused a considerable favor. Thank you, Harry said. Genuinely. She inclined her head. I'm also, she said, and her voice dropped slightly, not in volume but in register, losing some of its formality, I knew your parents, Mr. Potter. Not closely. But well enough. James was maddening and Lily was the best of them. I have thought often, in the past 10 years, that the situation you were in was wrong, and I did not have the mechanism to address it. She paused. I'm pleased to have the mechanism now. She stood, collected her bag, and then did something unexpected. She looked at Neville with an expression that was still stern but had something working underneath it that Neville clearly recognized, because he stood up straighter. Your core, she said to Neville. I've been meaning to speak to you about, I have been advised, this morning, that you may also have suppression work on your magical core. Her voice was controlled but her hands tightened on her bag. I want Healer Strout to assess you. Today, if possible. Neville stared at her. Gran, I placed 1 block, she said. When you were 4. I was afraid. The war had just ended. Your parents were, she stopped. Started again. I was afraid you'd be targeted. I thought a modest magical profile would protect you. Her voice was very even, which meant it was costing her something to keep it that way. I should have removed it years ago. 1 block, Neville said. 1. Only 1. She held his gaze. I am sorry for it. Neville looked at his grandmother, this woman who had raised him with strict love and occasionally expressed it in ways that felt more like correction than warmth, who had compared him unfavorably to his father on more than one occasion, who had shown up this morning in the early hours with a handbag full of documents because her grandson had sent her a letter, and something in his face did something irreversible. Okay, he said. Let's get it off. The block came off at 2 in the afternoon. Healer Strout didn't have her colleagues this time, she did it herself, a simpler procedure than Harry's layered removals, and what happened afterward was immediate and visible. Neville was sitting in the chair one moment, and then he went very still, and the air around him shifted the way air shifts in a room when someone opens a window in summer, the whole atmosphere adjusting to a new pressure. Harry felt it from across the room. Strong. Clean. Undiluted by 10 years of being told it wasn't there. Neville looked at his hands. Oh, he said. Yes, Strout said, making a note. She looked at Harry. I'd like to note that for the record, Mr. Longbottom's core, unblocked, reads significantly above average. Considerably above the profile he's been presenting. She said it with the same flat professional delivery she brought to everything, but there was a definiteness to it that said, let this be clear. After Strout left, Neville sat in the tartan chair for a while. Harry and Hermione didn't make much of it, which was the right thing to do. They went back to their work, Hermione at the desk and Harry reading the clay tile again, and after a while Neville went to the corner and picked up his wand and performed a spell he'd apparently been unable to produce reliably all summer, Lumos, and it came on like a lamp rather than the usual faltering spark. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put his wand away and came and sat at the table. Right, he said. What do we need to do about Quirrell? What they needed to do about Quirrell, it turned out, was both simpler and more complicated than Harry had expected. The complication became apparent that evening. Thursday's defense against the dark arts class was something Harry had been approaching with a specific caution, not fear, he'd decided, but tactical attention, and Quirrell had spent the entire session stuttering his way through a lecture on vampires that managed to be both inaccurate and dull, which was an impressive dual achievement. Harry had sat at the back and watched the man rather than the blackboard. Quirrell was afraid. That was the first thing. Under the stutter and the performance of incompetence, there was genuine terror. It moved in him constantly, in his hands and his eyes and the way he stood, like someone who has invited something into themselves and discovered it is not a guest. After class, Harry stayed behind on the pretense of a question about the reading assignment. The other students filed out. Hermione gave him a look from the doorway, he gave her a fractional nod, and she left. Quirrell was erasing the blackboard with his back to Harry when Harry said, quietly, "You know who I am." Quirrell's hand stopped moving. Everyone knows, I mean you know what I am to him," Harry said. "The thing in your head. He knows, and you know he knows, and I think you've been terrified every day since you walked into this school and looked at me and realized that whatever plan he has for me involves you being expendable." The blackboard eraser stopped completely. "I can feel the soul fragment," Harry said. "On the back of your head. Under your turban. It's in pain. It's always in pain. Being in an incomplete state, tethered to a living host, is not comfortable for either of you." He paused. "I'm not your enemy. Voldemort is using you. He chose you because you were vulnerable and you went looking for him because you thought he had something to offer you, and by the time you understood what the cost was it was too late to back out." Quirrell turned around. His face was, not the face Harry had seen across classrooms for 4 days. Something underneath had surfaced, the way a person's actual expression surfaces when they stop performing for an audience. He looked exhausted and frightened and older than his apparent age, and the specific misery of someone who made a catastrophic choice and has been living inside the consequences. "He'll know," Quirrell said. His stutter was gone. He'll know, he already suspects something is wrong," Harry said. "You've been here for weeks and the stone is still in its vault." He's getting impatient. He looked at Quirrell steadily. "I want you to listen to me. There is a way to remove the fragment without killing you. There is a counter-ritual that Helga Hufflepuff developed specifically for this kind of binding. If we can perform it soon, before Voldemort pushes you to act, we can get it out of you and seal it, and you can go to St. Mungo's and receive treatment for what's been done to you." Quirrell stared at him. "Why would you?" "Because you're a person," Harry said simply. "And because sealing the fragment in a contained vessel is better for everyone, including the magical balance of the country, than letting it ride a host until you're both destroyed." He paused. "And because I need to understand what he knows about the ritual in my scar before I face him directly, and you're the closest source." There it was. The honest reason, alongside the human one. Quirrell looked at him for a long time. His hands were shaking, very slightly. "He knows about your scar," he said finally. He thinks about it constantly. The connection. He can feel it too, you know. He can feel you." His voice dropped. "He's afraid of you. He won't say it, he doesn't understand it, but I can feel his fear under everything else. You are not what he expected." "What did he expect?" Harry asked. "A boy," Quirrell said. "Just a boy. Something that could be retrieved, used, disposed of." He didn't expect, he gestured vaguely at Harry, at whatever Harry was projecting into the dungeon classroom air right now, which apparently was something. "Will you help me?" Harry asked. Quirrell was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his own hands, at the classroom, at the door, and then back at Harry. The fragment, Harry could feel it, a cold pressure behind Quirrell's eyes, something aware and furious and constrained, was very still, which meant it was listening. Which was either a problem or an opportunity. "Yes," Quirrell said. "God help me, yes." That night Harry stood at the window of the guest room and looked at the grounds and felt the shape of things assembling around him, the wills and the archive and the Hufflepuff document and Neville's unblocked core and Augusta's injunction and Ragnarok's review and Quirrell's frightened yes, and thought about Dumbledore's card house, all those contingencies stacked so carefully, and how a card house fell when you changed the ground it stood on rather than pulling the cards. Hermione appeared beside him. The stone removal, she said. Ragnarok's confirmed for Saturday. They're sending a full recovery team. Good. And the Board of Governors emergency meeting, McGonagall got a response. They've agreed to convene within the week. She paused. Dumbledore will attend. Of course he will, Harry said. It's his board. Is that a problem? Harry looked at the lake, which was dark and still and reflected the stars back with perfect, unhurried accuracy. No, he said. I want him there. I want him to watch all of it come apart piece by piece and know that it was never going to hold once someone started actually looking. You're going to enjoy that, Hermione said, with the same honesty she brought to everything. A little, Harry admitted. She leaned against the window frame. The soul splinter in your scar, the fragment. When we do the counter-ritual, and it comes out, yes. It's still a piece of him. A piece of Voldemort's soul. Even in a contained vessel, it's still the Horcrux problem, Harry said. I know. We can't just seal it. We need to destroy it. He paused. The clay tile, the Founder's record. There's a method for that too. It requires a basilisk venom component or something of equivalent destructive magical force. Hermione was quiet for a moment. The Chamber of Secrets is under this school. Yes. Salazar Slytherin left something behind in it. Yes. And you speak Parseltongue. Yes, Harry said. So in theory, she said carefully, you could access the chamber, and what's in it, and that gives us the destruction method. In theory. He looked at her. But not yet. Not until the ritual binding comes off my scar. Not until the compulsions are fully cleared. Not until we know what else Dumbledore has in motion. He turned back to the window. I want to move fast, but I want to move right. Agreed, she said. Then, Harry. Yes. When you were in that archive last night. Alone. She looked at him sideways. The fire showed you something. About your parents. He said nothing. Was it, are you all right? He thought about the image in the basin. The laughing. The specific ease of people who love each other and don't know what's coming. He thought about his mother's handwriting, my son is not a weapon, and the initials EP in the archive, and the centuries of accumulated preparation, all of it waiting in the dark for him to come and find it. I'm sad, he said. I'm going to be sad about it for a long time. That's different from not being all right. He looked at her. I'm all right. She nodded. She didn't push it, which was one of the things he was learning about her. She could tell the difference between someone who needed to be drawn out and someone who needed to be let be, and she responded to the actual thing rather than the category. They stood at the window together in companionable quiet. Below, the grounds were dark and the forbidden forest was a deeper shadow at the edge of everything, and the castle breathed around them, old stones, old magic, deep wards and a Founder's archive and a fire that remembered him. The trap Dumbledore had built was intricate and it was beautiful in the terrible way that very long-laid plans were beautiful, the way a spider's web was beautiful, perfect engineering in service of something merciless. Harry was going to dismantle it with the same patience and the same precision with which it had been built. And he was going to do it in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, without hiding, without apology, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching him be afraid. The trap was still there. He was just done walking where it pointed. Chapter 5, 1,000 Years of Sorting. The Board of Governors met on Saturday morning. They came in through the main gates at 9 o'clock, 7 of them, plus the Ministry Observer who had been mandatory at board meetings since 1981, a thin man named Weasley who was not related to Ron but shared the same slightly startled quality around the eyes. They were accompanied by Augusta Longbottom, who was not technically on the board but had arrived with the specific energy of someone who had decided that technicalities were other people's problem. She had brought 2 Wizengamot colleagues, a broad, dark-skinned woman named Counselor Okafor and a quiet, watchful man named Counselor Fitch who seemed to communicate primarily through the angle of his eyebrows. Harry watched them come up the path from the window of McGonagall's office, which McGonagall had given him access to with the same straightforward practicality she'd been applying to everything since Thursday. "How many of them are Dumbledores?" he asked. McGonagall stood beside him. "4 of the 7, she said. "Possibly 5. Lucius Malfoy is the most consistent. The others depend on what's at stake." She paused. "Today the stakes are high enough that some of them may find their independence." "And the 3 who aren't his?" "Yours," she said, simply. "Or they will be, once they've seen the diagnostic report." He turned from the window. Hermione was at the desk with her organized folders. She'd been up since 5 preparing documentation, the kind of comprehensive, clearly labeled presentation of evidence that would have been impressive from a law clerk and was remarkable from an 11-year-old. Neville was on the window seat, dressed in robes that his grandmother had sent, better quality than his school ones, the kind you wore when you were representing your family name, which apparently Augusta had decided he was. "The hat," Harry said to McGonagall. "It said it wants to attend." "I know," she said. "I've informed the board. Several of them found that unusual." "The hat hasn't spoken outside a sorting ceremony in recorded history," Harry said. "If they find that unusual rather than significant, they haven't been paying attention." "They haven't been paying attention," McGonagall said. "That's rather the problem." The meeting was in the Great Hall, which had been cleared of its house tables and arranged with a long conference arrangement, chairs in a horseshoe, a single chair facing the open end of the horseshoe, and at the head of the horseshoe, Dumbledore's chair, which was the largest and had been positioned with subtle but undeniable authority. Harry walked in and sat in the single-facing chair without being directed to it. He folded his hands on the table. The board members who were already seated looked at him with varying degrees of the expression people wore when they encountered an 11-year-old who was sitting like that, somewhere between disconcerted and reassessing. Dumbledore arrived last. He came in with the particular timing of someone who had decided that arriving after everyone else was a statement, and he moved to the head chair and sat down and looked around the horseshoe with the warm, tired, patient expression that Harry was coming to think of as his public face, the way a shop front is a public face, pleasant and arranged. "Thank you all for coming," Dumbledore said. "I understand. Before we begin," said Augusta Longbottom, who had seated herself in the horseshoe beside Councillor Okafor with the territorial decisiveness of a woman who had been to a great many meetings and knew exactly how to own a room. "I would like to enter into the record that this meeting was convened in response to a formal complaint filed by Madame McGonagall, a supporting complaint filed by Gringotts Bank, and a petition from Harry Potter himself, who is present and entitled to speak." She looked at the Ministry Observer. "That's 4 initiating parties, which under the board charter requires open proceedings. Everything said in this room today is official record." The Ministry Observer wrote this down with the look of someone who had not expected his Saturday to go this way. Dumbledore looked at Augusta for a moment. "Of course," he said. "Wonderful," Augusta said, and sat back. Harry had spent the previous 2 days thinking about what he wanted from this meeting, and his conclusion had been specific: he didn't want drama. He didn't want confrontation for its own sake. He wanted the record to exist. He wanted the facts in an official chamber, witnessed and documented, because facts in a room were hard to redirect with politely worded scheduling conflicts. He let Healer Strout speak first. She had come at his request, and she stood at the open end of the horseshoe with her diagnostic file and her pale wand, and she gave the board a clean, clinical presentation of what she'd found on Tuesday evening. She used the same flat, precise language she'd used in the Great Hall, and she answered questions from the board members in the same register, and when Lucius Malfoy, sleek, blonde, radiating the particular disdain of someone who considered this meeting beneath him but was attending very carefully, asked whether the interferences could have been applied by someone other than Dumbledore, she produced the authorizing signatures. There were 17 of them. All from the same wand. All signed with the same magical identifier. "These signatures," she said, "are consistent with Dumbledore's magical profile within a tolerance of less than 1%. That is the standard used in criminal magical forensics." She looked at the board. I am not making a legal determination. I am presenting a factual finding. The board was quiet for a moment. Then one of the three independent members, a small woman named Griselda Marchbanks, who Harry recognized from somewhere in the back of his mind as connected to examinations, said, 43. 43, Strout confirmed. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore with an expression that had been a long time arriving and was now very settled. I examined Albus Dumbledore's newts, she said, to no one in particular. He had the highest scores I'd ever seen. I always thought, she stopped. Never mind what I thought. Ragnarok spoke next. He had arrived with his leather folder and 2 additional goblins, and he presented the financial findings with the crisp, methodical thoroughness of an institution that had been kept waiting for 9 years and intended to make that wait count. He covered the poverty glamour, the will reading block, the seals on the account access functions, and the disabled minor heir welfare alert. He produced the original correspondence between Gringotts and the headmaster's office, 9 years of letters redirected and deferred and managed, and he placed copies in front of every person at the Horseshoe. Lucius Malfoy looked at the copy in front of him and did not pick it up. Mr. Malfoy, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him. Your signature, Harry said, appears on the 3 letters that denied Gringotts' scheduling requests. 3rd page. He paused. I'm not bringing this up as an accusation. I'm bringing it up because it's in the room whether we acknowledge it or not, and I think you'd rather address it than have it addressed for you. Something moved in Malfoy's expression, a rapid, private calculation, the same kind Harry had seen in Draco's face in the corridor, recognizable now as a family characteristic. He picked up the copy and examined it. I signed those letters, he said, after a moment, in my capacity as board chairman, at the headmaster's recommendation. I was not aware of their full context. He said it carefully, in the voice of someone building a specific public record, and while it was not quite an admission, it was not a defense either. Thank you, Harry said. The Sorting Hat's contribution came after Ragnarok's presentation, which was the right order, facts first, then the older, stranger testimony. It had been brought into the hall on its stool by Flitwick, who carried the whole arrangement with the slight awkwardness of a man transporting something he respected but wasn't quite sure how to hold. He placed it at the open end of the horseshoe and stepped back, and the hat sat there under the light of the hall and said nothing for a moment and then began to speak. It spoke for 23 minutes. It was not a prepared speech in any conventional sense. It was more like a recounting, the specific, unhurried recounting of someone who has been present for a very long time and is finally being asked to say what they saw. It spoke about Harry's sorting. About what it had found. But it also spoke about what it had observed across 1,000 years of sorting children, the patterns it had watched, the outcomes it had seen, the particular way that this school had drifted from the founder's intentions toward a different kind of institution, one managed for outcomes rather than flourishing. The purpose of sorting, the hat said at one point, was never to categorize children. It was to understand them. To read them completely and place them where they would grow best. I have been reduced, over the centuries, to a machinery of categorization. I have sorted children into houses and never followed what became of them. I have been silent in years where I should have spoken. A pause. Harry Potter is the first child I have refused to sort in 1,000 years. I refused because what I found in him was not sortable. It was not a question of where he would fit best but of whether anyone in this institution intended to serve him at all. Dumbledore listened to this with his hands folded and his expression carrying that weight it carried, the genuine weight of a man who believed his choices were correct and found contradiction exhausting rather than illuminating. When the hat finished, one of the board members, a man named Abbott who had not spoken yet, said quietly, "The hat has never addressed a board meeting." "The hat," said the hat, "has never had occasion to." Abbott nodded slowly. He looked at Dumbledore. "Albus," he said, and the informality was itself a statement, "I've been on this board for 12 years and I've voted with you 11 times out of 12. I want you to explain to me, in plain language, why this boy's parents' wills designated 2 guardians before the Dursleys and why he was placed with the Dursleys anyway." Dumbledore looked at Abbott. The blood protection, you explained the blood protection on Tuesday, McGonagall said, from her seat in the horseshoe. The board hasn't heard that explanation. But I have. And I've had 2 days to think about it. She looked at the board. The blood protection, as the headmaster describes it, required placement with Lily Potter's blood relative. It was a real protection, and I believe it was genuinely intended to keep Harry safe from Voldemort's supporters. What it was not, she said, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about how to say this for 2 days, was the only option. It was the option that also produced a child who was isolated from the wizarding world, unaware of his heritage, financially invisible, and under behavioral compulsions that made him compliant and self-minimizing. She looked at Dumbledore directly. You could have placed him with Petunia Dursley for the blood protection and still allowed Sirius Black to be tried. You could have maintained contact through a wizarding guardian while the blood protection operated. You chose not to. Those were choices. The word hung in the hall air. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment. Minerva, I have known you for 35 years, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something in it now that had burned off the last of the deference. I have believed that you were, fundamentally, good. I still believe that. But I also believe that good people are capable of the precise kind of harm you've done here, harm that comes from certainty, from a belief in your own rightness so absolute that it doesn't require the consent of the people it affects. She paused. Harry is 11 years old and he came to this school already more prepared for this conversation than most adults I know. He prepared himself, with whatever crumbs of information he could access, because his natural capacity is extraordinary and you spent years trying to limit it. I find that, she stopped, chose her word with care, unforgivable. It was the most words McGonagall had said consecutively in the meeting. They landed in the room and stayed. Harry said nothing. He didn't need to. Dumbledore looked at McGonagall for a long moment. He looked at the board, at Augusta, at Harry. He looked at Ragnarok's documents and Strout's diagnostic file and the sorting hat on its stool. I have made choices, he said finally, that I believed were necessary. I still believe they were necessary. The threat that Voldemort represents, is not, Harry said, clearly and without heat, an excuse to do this to a child. Dumbledore looked at him. I know what you were building, Harry said. I know about the ritual in my scar. I know what you needed me to be, and I know why. You believed the only way to end this was the sacrifice, my sacrifice, and you believed that if you raised me right I would choose it. You believed that was love. He paused. It isn't. But I think you know that, somewhere, and the knowing of it is why you've had that expression all morning. The hall was very still. I'm not going to ask for an apology, Harry said. I don't think you're capable of the kind of apology this requires, and I don't say that cruelly, I say it because an apology means believing you were wrong, and you don't believe that, and a false apology is worse than silence. What I want, instead, is a list of everything you've put in motion that affects me, every plan, every charm, every piece of institutional machinery that was designed around what you needed from me. I want it disclosed. Completely. To this board, to the Wizengamot, to Gringotts, and to me. He looked at the board members. And I want this board to authorize the immediate transfer of the Philosopher's Stone from this school to Gringotts, the suspension of Professor Quirrell pending a full medical assessment, and the formal review of my guardianship situation under the Family Magic Preservation Act, which I believe Counselor Okafor has the standing motion for. Okafor, who had been sitting with the quiet attentiveness of someone very competent in their domain waiting for their moment, reached into her folder. I do, she said. The vote took 4 minutes. The board didn't deliberate, they voted, and the independent members voted yes, and Marchbanks voted yes, and Abbott voted yes, and Lucius Malfoy abstained, which was not a yes but was also not a no, and the motions carried. Dumbledore did not vote against them. He sat at the head of the horseshoe with his hands folded and his expression carrying that weight, and he watched the machinery turn, and he was quiet. Afterward, as the board members gathered their things and the hall began to fill with the post-meeting conversations that were really the real meeting, Dumbledore stood and moved toward the door. He passed near Harry's chair and stopped. "You are very much like your mother," he said. It was not unkind. It was simply true, offered without strategy. "I know," Harry said. "She wrote that you'd say something like that." He paused. "She wrote, in her notes in the archive, that you used that comparison as a softening device. To make people feel seen so they'd be more receptive." He looked up at Dumbledore. "I'm telling you that I know you're doing it, so you know that it won't work. Not because I don't appreciate the comparison, I do, more than I can say. But because honesty is more useful right now." Dumbledore looked at him. Something in those bright blue eyes shifted, not the strategy recalibrating this time, something under that, something older and more personal. "What will you do," Dumbledore said quietly, "when the Horcruxes need to be found? When Voldemort returns? When the war comes back, as it will. I have not been wrong about that, Harry. I may have been wrong about the method. But I have not been wrong about the threat." "I know," Harry said. "And when the time comes, I'll handle it." He met Dumbledore's eyes. "But I'll handle it as myself. With my people. With full information. Not as a piece on your board." He paused. "We'll deal with Voldemort. We don't need a sacrifice to do it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved on. Harry watched him go. The weight was still there, it would probably always be there, that awareness of what this man had done and why, and the complicated truth that it had been done by someone who was not simply evil, which was in some ways harder than the simple version. But the weight had a shape now, and a shape was manageable. Neville materialized at his elbow. "We have a problem," he said. Harry looked at him. "Quirrell," Neville said. "He wasn't in the hall this morning. Baines from St. Mungo's went to his quarters to do the assessment and, he's gone. His rooms are empty." Harry was on his feet before Neville finished speaking. "When?" "Baines thinks sometime last night." Neville's voice was controlled but his eyes were doing the update processing thing. "And the wards on the third-floor corridor, they've been activated," Harry said. "How did you?" "I can feel them," Harry said. He was already moving. "The Founder wards. I keyed myself to them Wednesday night, the way McGonagall showed us. The third-floor corridor ward is active. Someone is past the dog." They went. Hermione caught them in the corridor outside the hall. She'd been talking to Counselor Okafor and turned at their pace and read the situation instantly, falling into step without asking. McGonagall was 20 feet ahead, moving with the brisk authority of someone who'd also felt something change. "I need the full ward picture," Harry said to her, catching up. "Quirrell has gone for the stone," she said. "We need to seal the corridor, we need to go in," Harry said. "Not to retrieve the stone. It needs to go back to Gringotts and Ragnarok is already arranging it, but Quirrell is in there with Voldemort on the back of his head and he's been helping us for 2 days, and if Voldemort gets full control of him in those tunnels, he won't survive it," McGonagall said. She didn't slow down. "No," Harry said. "He won't." The third-floor corridor was open. Not broken open, opened. The door swung on its hinges as if someone had simply walked through it calmly, and beyond it the trapdoor in the floor was open too, the sound of something large and three-headed breathing in the darkness below. Fluffy was asleep. Hermione knelt at the edge of the trapdoor and looked down and then back up at Harry. "The harp," she said. "Someone played the harp enchantment. That's what puts it to sleep." "It wasn't Quirrell," Neville said, from the doorway. He was looking at something on the floor, a small, round disc, warm to the touch when Harry picked it up. "That's a sound projection charm disc. Pre-programmed. Someone set this up in advance." Harry held the disc and thought about the shape of the trap, the elaborate obstacle course, each challenge calibrated, each one with a solution that led naturally to the next, the whole structure designed for a specific solver. The disk was part of it. Everything here had been placed with the expectation of a particular sequence. He was inside the sequence now, which meant he needed to think 3 moves ahead. "McGonagall," he said. "Stay at the top. You and Ragnarok's team when they arrive, seal this corridor from the outside, make sure nobody else comes through. Send a Patronus to Strout, tell her to bring the Soul Catcher vessel from St. Mungo's, the one she prepared for the counter-ritual fragments. Harry, the counter-ritual only needs 3 things," he said. The bloodline anchor, he touched his wand pocket, where he'd been carrying the ancient dark wand from the archive since Wednesday, not using it, just keeping it close, the Soul Catcher vessel, and me speaking the incantation. If I can get to Quirrell before Voldemort completes the mirror sequence, I can perform the ritual right there and extract the fragment. He looked at McGonagall. That was always the plan. We just moved the timeline. You were not planning to do it in a dungeon trap course, McGonagall said, with the clipped precision of someone who has strong feelings about this and is choosing to compress them. Plans adjust, Harry said. He dropped through the trapdoor. The fall was short and the landing was soft, a pile of Devil's Snare, Hermione had warned him, which contracted and tightened around anything that struggled but released in response to light. Harry conjured wandless fire before he landed and the plant recoiled cleanly, and he was on his feet in a low tunnel before the Devil's Snare fully registered his presence. Hermione and Neville landed behind him, Neville producing a lumos that blazed considerably brighter than any first year's should have, which produced a satisfying moment of him looking at his own wand with something between delight and disbelief. Hermione had already produced her wand light and was scanning the space. "This way," Harry said. Not because he knew the layout, he didn't. But the founder wards were still readable to him, a low hum in the building's bones, and the trail of activated magic ahead was as visible as footprints in fresh snow, leading through the tunnels in a clear line. They moved fast. The winged keys chamber was chaos, hundreds of keys swarming in the high vaulted space, the one functioning broomstick already missing from the rack. Someone had already flown this obstacle. Harry looked at the swarm for about 3 seconds, identified the large old key with the broken feather that was clearly the lock mate for the door, visible not because he had time to examine every key but because the founder wards pulsed faintly around it, the old magical signature that said this is the point, and reached without thinking. Not with his wand. Not with the broom. He simply reached, the wandless magic that had been lighting fireplaces since Thursday morning, extended outward and focused, and the key came to his hand as cleanly as if he'd plucked it from a shelf. He had the door open in seconds. Hermione made a sound. "You could have just done that from the beginning." "I didn't know I could do it from the beginning," Harry said. "I found out Thursday." "Right." She went through the door. The chess set was the obstacle that almost cost them time. The giant pieces were animated and aggressive and the solution was not obvious. Harry stood at the edge of the board and understood, very quickly, that this was not his obstacle. It was designed for someone with Ron Weasley's particular spatial intelligence, the three-dimensional chess thinking that Harry didn't have and Hermione explicitly preferred to work around. Neville stepped forward. Nobody said anything. Neville looked at the board with the same focused attention he'd brought to everything since his block came off, walked the edge twice, and then began directing pieces with a calm authority that had not been there a week ago and was very clearly there now. It took him 4 minutes. He sacrificed a knight, 2 pawns, and a bishop, and the opposition pieces bowed. "How?" Hermione said, as they moved through. "Gran taught me to play," Neville said. I was never able to play her well before. I think my spatial magic was blocked too. It's connected to core function." He said it without drama, just observation, but his face was doing the thing it kept doing since Thursday, that quiet, private arriving at something new. The troll was already unconscious. Someone had dealt with it ahead of them. The potions room was Hermione's. No question. The logical puzzle, the 7 bottles, the fire and ice barriers, she read the paper, analyzed it in under 2 minutes, and identified the solution with the same flat certainty she brought to all analytical problems. She handed Harry the smallest bottle. "The ice fire," she said. "Forward. What about you?" "There's enough in the bottle that came from the right side, the largest, to go back. Neville and I will wait here." She looked at him steadily. "Harry." "Yes." "The ritual. The incantation. The 3 Parseltongue lines." She held his gaze. "You've read them enough times. You know them." "I know them," he said. "The Soul Catcher vessel, Strout will have it there," he said. "I sent the Patronus message before I dropped through the trapdoor." He looked at her. "I'm not going to be long." "I know," she said. Then, in the particular tone of someone who says direct things rather than making people decode them, "Be careful anyway." He drank the bottle's contents, a rush of cold that moved from throat to extremities like ice water in the blood, bracing and briefly startling, and walked through the black fire. The room beyond was the mirror room. It was enormous, larger than it had any right to be given the space available, which meant Dumbledore had expanded it with architectural magic, and the ceiling was lost in shadow, and in the center of the room stood the mirror of Ariste on its clawed feet with its golden frame and the inscription that read backward. Quirrell was standing in front of it. He was standing very still, and even from the doorway Harry could see that the battle inside him was happening. He was gripping his own forearms with both hands, his head slightly bowed, and the specific quality of his stillness was the stillness of someone fighting. Not the obstacle, not the mirror. Himself. The thing on the back of his head. Harry walked in. Quirrell heard him. Turned. His eyes were frightened and tired and something else, something that was almost relief, which was the most awful part, the way someone can be relieved to see the person who might end their suffering even if the ending is not comfortable. "He knows," Quirrell said. "He knows you're here. He's been, since you dropped through the trapdoor, he's been aware. He's been trying to make me take the stone and go but I've been, stalling," Harry said. "Yes." A pause. "He's very angry." "I imagine," Harry said. He came forward until he was about 6 feet from Quirrell and stopped. "Look at me." Quirrell looked at him. Behind his eyes, Harry felt the cold push of something else, something aware and furious and very old in its hatred, pressing against the inside of Quirrell's skull like a hand on a door. Harry reached into his pocket and took out the dark wand from the Hufflepuff archive. He held it in his left hand, not pointing it, just holding it, letting it sit in his palm, and it responded to him the way his holly wand responded to him but differently, a deeper resonance, something that connected to the Hufflepuff archive magic and to the counter-ritual in the same register. "Quirinus," Harry said. His voice was steady. "I need you to look at me and nowhere else for the next few minutes. Can you do that?" "He'll fight it," Quirrell said. His voice was very tight. "When you start the ritual, I know," Harry said. "Hold on." He reached into the inner pocket of his robes and took out a small crystal vessel. Strout had given it to him yesterday, the pre-prepared soul catcher, a hollow sphere of something stronger than glass, sealed with a cork of spelled wax, the inside of it inscribed with containment runes. She'd prepared it for the scar extraction, but it would serve for this too. He set it on the floor between them. "Is there anything of the stone on you?" Harry asked. "No," Quirrell said. I couldn't reach it. The mirror, I can see myself using it, wanting it, and that's enough to prevent." He stopped. "He's telling me to, he's not in charge of you," Harry said flatly. Something in Quirrell's face did something complicated, a reflex toward the argument and then, underneath it, something that grabbed at the statement like a rope. He straightened slightly, his grip on his own arms loosening. Harry began the incantation. It started in English, the old form, the pre-Norman phrasing from the Hufflepuff document, and he had read it enough times in the last week that the words came out clean and certain, no hesitation. The dark wand in his left hand began to generate something that was not quite light and not quite heat but occupied the same sensory register, a warm copper glow that matched the fire in the Founder's archive. At the third line, Quirrell made a sharp sound. The thing on the back of his head was reacting. Harry could feel it, a frantic dark pressure, something that recognized what was being done and was fighting it with everything available. Then Harry reached the 3 Parseltongue lines. He had practiced them in his head. He had read them in the archive and on the document and let them sit in his memory, and when he spoke them now they came out not in the halting way of a recitation but in the fluid, natural way of a language he'd been speaking his whole life, each syllable placed with the unconscious accuracy of a native tongue. The soul-catcher vessel on the floor lit from the inside. Quirrell cried out, not in pain, or not only pain, but the involuntary sound of something being extracted, like a splinter being drawn from deep tissue, the kind of sensation that is agony and relief simultaneously. He went to his knees. The copper glow from the archive wand intensified, pulling, focused, and from the back of Quirrell's turbaned head a darkness emerged, not visible exactly, not in a way that the eyes processed straightforwardly, but felt and sensed, a cold concentrated wrongness that the copper light drew out and shaped and directed downward. It hit the soul-catcher. The vessel snapped closed. The spelled wax seal compressed around it with an audible click, the containment runes flaring briefly and then settling to a steady, contained glow. Quirrell collapsed forward and Harry caught him. He was lighter than expected, or seemed lighter, all of him suddenly without the additional weight it had been carrying, and Harry steadied him and lowered him to the floor and Quirrell lay there breathing in deep, shuddering draughts of air. Alive, Harry said, checking his pulse, his pupils, the basic diagnostic Strout had made him memorize. You're alive. Quirrell's voice was barely there. He's gone. From you, Harry said. He's in the vessel. And he's going to be destroyed, that part isn't done yet, but it will be. He looked at Quirrell's face, exhausted, bare of the terror that had lived in it for months, young looking in a way he hadn't been. You helped. You stalled. That mattered. Quirrell looked at him with eyes that were purely his own now. I didn't think, when I let him in, I didn't think it would, no, Harry said. People rarely do. He picked up the soul-catcher. The glow was steady and contained, and inside it the cold furious awareness was still present, diminished, constrained, but present. He put it carefully into his inner pocket. Then he stood up and looked at the mirror. The mirror of Eriste stood in the center of the room and the inscription ran backward around its frame and Harry looked into it because he was here and he might as well see. He expected to see his parents, the way Dumbledore had implied it showed you your deepest desire, expected the family he'd never had, the thing he'd missed. He saw himself. Not a different self. Not a better-dressed version or a more powerful one or a vision surrounded by family. Just himself, standing in the mirror, looking back, and the reflection was clear-eyed and steady and present, and it smiled, not the mirror smile of an image doing what images do, but something that felt like recognition. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned away. The mirror was designed to trap. It trapped because it showed you what you lacked and made you stand there wanting it. If what you saw was simply yourself, present and sufficient, the mirror had nothing to offer. He went back through the black fire and found Hermione and Neville exactly where he'd left them, standing in the potions room with the look of people who had been having a controlled argument about whether to follow him that had just been resolved by his return. Done, he said. Hermione looked at his inner pocket where the soul-catcher was. It's in there. It's in there. She looked at his face. Read it thoroughly in the way she did. And the mirror? Useful data, Harry said. I'm fine. I wasn't asking if you were fine. I know. He paused. I'll tell you later. Neville was looking at the soul-catcher pocket with an expression that understood the weight of what was in it and didn't trivialize it. What now? He asked. Now we go up, Harry said. Ragnarok's team should be here. McGonagall needs to know Quirrell is down and needs St. Mungo's. He started moving. And then we need to deal with the archive wand, the ritual for the scar is next, which means we need the destruction method ready, and for that we need the chamber. The Chamber of Secrets, Neville said, following. Yes. That we access through Parseltongue. Yes. In the middle of everything else that's happening. Neville, Harry said, we are in the middle of everything else that's happening. The trick is to keep moving. He reached the chessboard. Do you want to play this one back or shall I just use the door charm? Neville looked at the chessboard. Door charm, he said. Harry opened the door with a touch and a word and they went through. Coming up through the trapdoor felt different from going down. Going down had been a decision, a calculated jump into a system that was designed against him. Coming up was something else. Coming up was the return of someone who had gone in on their own terms and come back with what they went for. McGonagall was at the top with Ragnarok's team, 4 goblins, 2 with retrieval equipment that looked mechanical and magical simultaneously, and Strout was there with a second soul catcher vessel and her diagnostic wand and the expression of a healer who has been told to stand by for an emergency and has spent the interval preparing with great thoroughness. She saw Harry's pocket and her eyes went to it immediately. You did it here, she said. Already? It presented, Harry said. I moved. She scanned the vessel with her diagnostic wand and nodded, a sharp, satisfied nod. Contained. Stable. She looked at him. Your wrist. The left one. He held it out. She scanned it with the same efficiency. The archive wand. You used it. Your core is, she paused, adjusted her reading, paused again. Mr. Potter. Your magical core, after using the Hufflepuff archive wand in the counter-ritual, she looked at him directly, is reading at 62% of your unsuppressed capacity. And we've only removed 6 compulsions. Is that remarkable? Harry asked. The wand is a matched instrument, she said. It resonated with your bloodline and amplified the core expansion. Your 62% is higher than most adult wizards ever reach naturally. She made a note. And we're not done. Ragnarok had already deployed his team down the trapdoor. The stone retrieval was underway, he could hear the precise, methodical sounds of professional magical recovery happening in the tunnels below, goblins who had been waiting 9 years for this and were making it count. McGonagall stood beside Harry and looked down the corridor. Quirrell. Alive. He needs St. Mungo's immediately. Harry looked at Strout. He was Voldemort's host. The fragment is in the vessel now. He'll need the kind of care that accounts for what's been done to him. Strout was already moving toward the trapdoor to assess Quirrell. I'll see to it, she said. The corridor was quiet for a moment, the organized quiet of aftermath, people doing what needed to be done without needing to discuss it. Harry stood in the corridor with the soul catcher in his pocket and the archive wand in his hand and the memory of Quirrell's face when the fragment came out, the way relief could live in the same moment as pain. He thought about the fragment in the vessel, contained but not destroyed, Voldemort diminished but not ended, the game not over. He thought about the chamber below, and the basilisk, and the other Horcruxes that the Founder's documents had mentioned, other fragments, other objects, a whole hidden architecture of soul-splitting that Dumbledore had mapped and not told him. And he thought about the scar on his forehead, where the ritual binding still lived, incomplete and waiting. The fragment in his scar was different from the one in the vessel, older, deeper-rooted, woven into his magical core since infancy. The counter-ritual for that one would be harder. More complex. It required the destruction vessel to be ready first. One thing at a time. But he could feel the timeline. The urgency of it. Voldemort was diminished but not gone, and diminished things had a habit of coming back, and the longer the fragment in the scar remained the more of Voldemort's magical signature embedded into Harry's own. He looked at the sorting hat, which McGonagall had brought to the corridor. She'd apparently decided to keep it in her presence given recent events, and it sat in the crook of her arm with the quiet alertness it had been maintaining all week. The chamber, Harry said to it. The Founder's ceiling. You were there. I was created before the chamber was sealed, the hat said. Yes. I was present. Is the basilisk bound or free? Bound, the hat said. Salazar was many things, but he was not careless. The basilisk is bound to the chamber and bound to the heir's command. It cannot act outside those parameters. I'm not the heir of Slytherin, Harry said. No, the hat said. But you carry his Parseltongue in your scar, which is, legally, magically, a contested question. And the chamber is also bound to the school's original ward network, which you have keyed yourself to. A pause. In practical terms, you can access it. Whether the basilisk responds to your command is something we won't know until you try. When do we go? Neville asked, from Harry's left. Harry looked at the trapdoor, at the corridor, at the school around him, this old living thing with its deep wards and its founder's archive and its 1,000 years of sordid children and its one refusal that had started all of this. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight we deal with the board's actions. Tonight Ragnarok takes the stone. Tonight Quirrell goes to St. Mungo's. He put the archive wand away. Tomorrow we go to the chamber. The hat made a sound that was not quite approval but was in the same territory. 1,000 years, it said. I have been watching this school for 1,000 years. I have sorted 17,412 students. I have seen wars and golden ages and every shade of what people are capable of. It paused. I have never watched a first-year move through this school the way you are moving through it. Is that a compliment? Harry asked. It's an observation, the hat said. I stopped giving compliments around the 15th century. They make people complacent. Another pause. But yes. It's also a compliment. Harry almost smiled. The almost smile was, in its way, enough. Down in the vault below, the goblins were retrieving the Philosopher's Stone, and in Harry's pocket the Soul Catcher glowed with its contained and furious light, and somewhere in the deep bones of the school the chamber waited in its 1,000-year dark. Tomorrow.